None of us was truly prepared for this moment. At the end of October 2025, when the night sky still glowed faintly under a thin crescent moon hanging in the east, the cold, unfeeling numbers from observatories around the world rang out like funeral bells. Astronomers were no longer whispering in cramped meeting rooms. They went public before the world as a whole. Something abnormal was happening. Something so unprecedented that every notion of probability, every classical framework of celestial mechanics, suddenly looked like shredded paper. We had grown used to a silent universe, where an occasional meteor streaked by, just to remind us that fragments of ancient debris still wandered out there. But this time, it wasn't one or two. It was 7 blazing celestial bodies, 7 torches of ice and stone, hurtling into the same narrow frame of time. The shock wasn't just in the number 7. It lay in the fact that all of them, each born in different distant corners of the solar system, chose this very moment to step onto the stage. Imagine sitting in a massive theatre, the velvet curtain slowly rising, and instead of one performer stepping out, all 7 storm the stage at once. No introduction, no rehearsal, no warning. That feeling, breathless, panicked, as though some invisible director were orchestrating it all, was exactly what humanity was experiencing. The first news bulletin sent millions into sleepless nights. Scientific forums exploded, and social media cracked under a storm of speculation. Could this be the opening act of an apocalypse festival? The anxiety deepened when the stark, linear data streaming from computers quietly revealed something else. At that very same time, a mysterious traveler from beyond our star system appeared, an interstellar stranger, astronomers named with a dry but trembling designation. 3I divided by Atlas. This was no comet born of the Sunday. It was an outsider, a wanderer from some faraway star, and with cruel coincidence, it chose to pass through our solar system just as those 7 torches made their entrance. When this detail went public, international headlines screamed in red, "Is the universe sending us a signal, or winding up a strike?" That night, countless people stepped outside to look up, but instead of romance, they felt something nameless. Goosebumps crawling across their skin, hearts pounding, eyes straining to catch the streaks of light. In Tokyo, a mother clutched her son as he asked, "Mom, what if they all crash into Earth?" In Europe, church bells rang not because it was time for prayer, but because crowds demanded comfort. Online, thousands of videos spread like wildfire, set to dramatic soundtracks, and 3D renderings of 7 icy torches colliding with our planet. For the first time in decades, science ceased to be the safe realm of numbers and became a collective nightmare, sowing fear that sank into the marrow. And amid the shock, a darker kind of curiosity began to bloom. People started to ask, what if this isn't a coincidence? What if some hand, a force, an intelligence, or a mechanism we've never known is playing a game of Go with the entire solar system? Those questions went unanswered, but they made humanity's blood boil with equal parts fear and wonder. Curiosity, dread, and the uncanny feeling of being watched by a giant eye hidden behind the cosmic curtain. And that was only the beginning. In the days that followed, the initial shock did not subside. On the contrary, it spread like an invisible fever, sweeping from cramped laboratories to bustling public squares. With every passing hour, another fragment of data was released, and each new number landed like a hammer blow on the human mind. The orbital charts displayed on giant television screens were no longer just sterile curves. They had turned into blazing scars wrapped around Earth, as if our planet had been marked, circled like a target in some dreadful cosmic game. Scientists tried to remain calm, but the tremor in their voices during press conferences only fueled public unease. "This is a rare phenomenon. We have no evidence of alignment. More observation is needed," they said. Yet the pauses after each phrase were precisely where fear ignited. The world heard helplessness. They saw the hollow eyes of men and women who had spent their lives behind telescopes, now uncertain of what they were even seeing. And when a young astronomer slipped on live television and muttered, "The probability of 3I divided by Atlas and 7 comets arriving together is less than 1 in 10 million, the murmurs erupted into shouts. 1 in 10 million, that was no longer a coincidence. It was a message. But from whom? And for what? Panic quickly spilled beyond the boundaries of science. Religious groups saw the signs of Judgment Day. Politicians smelled the stench of crisis and exploited it to stir their crowds. From Washington to Moscow to Beijing, calls for emergency preparedness arose, making the atmosphere even heavier. People began stockpiling food, digging shelters, and in some places, schools were closed for days because parents feared their children might witness catastrophe unfold on the playground. Amid this spiral of anxiety, the nights of observation became a kind of collective ritual. People no longer filled movie theaters or bars. Instead, they gathered in fields and on beaches, tilting their faces to the sky. But these were not romantic outings. They were silent vigils, every gaze carrying the same questions. Why all at once? Why right now? And why Atlas? The appearance of 3I divided by Atlas was the thorn driven deepest into humanity's psyche. If the 7 comets were a storm, then Atlas was the dagger flashing within that storm, the outsider from beyond the edge of the universe, carrying an absolute strangeness. It did not belong to us, and precisely because of that, it made every hypothesis more terrifying. On online forums, theories sprouted like weeds. Some insisted Atlas was a disguised reconnaissance craft. Others claimed the 7 comets were their accompanying satellites, shadows guided into the solar system like an advanced army. More extreme voices spread doctored videos of a space gate opening beyond Saturn's orbit, sowing the belief that this was only the first stage of an invasion. Experts tried to debunk them, but science's own uncertainty provided fertile ground for such ideas to thrive, and when restless curiosity fused with collective imagination, it produced a nightmare no fact-checking authority could extinguish. The world stood before a hazy choice. Believe this was merely probability's cruel joke, or admit that some force out there was whispering from afar. But whichever path they leaned toward, people still felt as though they had stepped beyond the threshold of their familiar safety. That boundary was gone. In the days that followed, the initial shock did not fade. On the contrary, it spread like an invisible fever, sweeping from cramped laboratories to noisy public squares. Every passing hour brought another fragment of data, and each new number struck like a hammer against the human mind. The orbital charts displayed on giant television screens were no longer sterile curves. They became blazing scars wrapped around Earth, as if our planet had been circled like a target in the terrifying game of the cosmos. Scientists tried to stay calm, but the tremor in their voices at press conferences only deepened public unease. This is a rare phenomenon. We have no evidence of alignment. More observation is required, they said. Yet the silences that followed each phrase were where fear truly erupted. The world heard helplessness. They saw the weary, shadowed eyes of those who had spent their lives behind telescopes, now no longer certain of what they were even seeing. And when a young astronomer blurted on live television, the probability of 3I divided by Atlas and 7 comets arriving together is less than 1 in 10 million. The murmurs turned into screams. 1 in 10 million, that was no longer a coincidence. That was a message. But from whom? And for what? Confusion quickly spilled beyond the boundaries of science. Religious organizations saw the signs of Judgment Day. Politicians sensed a crisis and exploited it to rally their supporters. From Washington to Moscow to Beijing, calls for emergency preparedness emerged, thickening the already heavy air. People began stockpiling food, digging shelters, and in some places, schools were closed for days because parents feared their children might witness disaster unfold right on the playground. Amid the spiral of anxiety, nights of observation turned into a kind of collective ritual. People no longer filled movie theaters or bars. Instead, they gathered in fields and on beaches, their faces tilted to the sky. But these were not romantic outings. They were silent vigils, each gaze carrying the same questions. Why all at once? Why now? And why Atlas? The appearance of 3I divided by Atlas was the thorn driven deepest into humanity's psyche. If the 7 comets were a storm, then Atlas was the dagger flashing within it, an outsider from the universe's edge, bearing absolute strangeness. It did not belong to us, and for that very reason, it made every hypothesis far more terrifying. On online forums, theories sprouted like weeds. Some declared Atlas to be a disguised scout ship. Others insisted the 7 comets were their companion satellites, shadows drawn into the solar system like an advance army. More extreme voices spread doctored clips, showing a space gate opening beyond Saturn's orbit, sowing the belief that this was merely the first stage of an invasion. Experts tried to debunk them, but science's own uncertainty became fertile soil for such ideas to thrive. And when restless curiosity fused with collective imagination, it birthed a nightmare no fact-checking agency could extinguish. The world stood before a hazy choice: to believe this was nothing more than probability's cruel trick, or to accept that some distant force was whispering from the far reaches of space. But whichever way people leaned, they felt they had stepped beyond the threshold of familiar safety. The cold, indifferent universe we once trusted was gone. Instead, high above, something was watching, and we, small and trembling, stood under the light of 7 blazing torches and the looming shadow of Atlas. By the 3rd week of October, the world had entered a state resembling a psychological earthquake, unlike anything in history. From the bustling city of New York to the tiny villages of the Andes, everything came to a halt, eyes fixed on the sky or glued to screens. Live streams from the world's great observatories turned into a kind of global mass, and people waited minute by minute, as if even a single blink might cause them to miss an event that could forever alter humanity's fate. Inside the control rooms of NASA, ESA, and JAXA, rows of monitors flickered, displaying tangled orbital paths that looked like webs of chaos. Every red trajectory line slashed deeper into the fragile calm of the world. At Mission Control, scientists tried to keep their voices steady. All 7 comets remain on their orbits. There are no signs of imminent collision with Earth. Yet, even as they spoke, sweat traced down their temples, and the moment a reporter pressed, "And what about Atlas? What is it really?" the room collapsed into a silence, heavy as a crypt. That silence echoed louder than any statement. It planted in the public's heart the conviction that something terrible was being concealed. Rumors spread at dizzying speed that Atlas was not a comet, not a fragment of frozen rock, but an enormous artificial structure, a station, even a lighthouse erected to summon the 7 other bodies. Across social media platforms, artist renderings were shared millions of times. Atlas transformed into a massive flaming eye, the 7 comets into blazing spears, all aimed at Earth. However absurd, those images deepened the fear, convincing millions that they were watching the opening act of an apocalypse. Panic did not stay confined to imagination. It erupted into action. Major cities recorded waves of panic buying. Supermarkets were stripped bare, and gas stations were overrun. In some places, minor riots broke out as crowds fought over supplies. In a South American village, locals built a makeshift wooden idol, praying for the forgiveness of the god Atlas. Meanwhile, in a European square, thousands shouted in unison, "We are not afraid. If there is intelligence out there, show yourself." A protest at once trembling and defiant. The shock only multiplied when the first direct images of Atlas arrived. Space telescopes captured an unusually long shadow, its glowing tail flickering even from millions of kilometers away. Experts explained that it was merely ice sublimating into vapor, but the public refused to believe it. What they saw was a sail, a flag, or even a mechanical arm fluttering in the void. Every pixel blown up became evidence. Every burst of static noise was interpreted as Morse code from beyond. And so curiosity, fused with dread, transformed into collective obsession. People no longer looked to the sky for romance, but for answers. Who was sending a message? And what was that message? From that moment on, the world was no longer simply watching an astronomical event. The world was listening to a ghostly echo, a chilling whisper that might have come from the very edge of the universe. And humanity, however shaken, could not look away. As October slipped by day after day, the global atmosphere felt like a glass sphere on the verge of shattering. News of the 7 comets and 3 I divided by Atlas was no longer confined to scientists. It seeped into every household, into every ordinary conversation. Children no longer sang lullabies before bed. Instead, they asked their parents, "Are we going to disappear?" Adults stopped talking about stock prices and instead exchanged quiet, helpless glances. The elderly, those who had lived through wars and crises, confessed, "Never have we seen the world tremble like this." Astronomers tried to soothe the fear. They presented data showing that the orbital paths did not intersect Earth, that the chance of collision was 0. But no one was truly at ease, because the question was no longer, "Will they fall?" It was, "Why did they all arrive at once?" That was the fracture logic could not mend, the nucleus of the collective nightmare. Humanity felt as though it had been placed inside a vast experiment, one over which it had no control. And at the center of the storm, Atlas became the symbol of chilling silence. It sent no signal, altered no path, did nothing at all. Yet it was precisely that absolute indifference that suffocated humanity. If it were just a random celestial body, silence would make sense. But if it were something else, an intelligent construct, an observing instrument, perhaps even a warning, then its silence became a merciless verdict. We were not worthy of an answer. Millions gazed at Atlas and saw not just a block of ice and rock, but a mirror projecting their deepest fears back at them. Perhaps the most terrifying part was not the possibility of apocalypse, but the naked realization of how small humanity truly was. All the civilizations, the radiant cities, the political struggles, suddenly they shrank to dust before this haunting coincidence. Humanity trembled, not because it believed death was imminent, but because it suddenly understood it had never truly grasped the universe, and perhaps the universe had no interest in explaining itself. On the final nights of the month, as the 7 comets began to glow in long exposure images and Atlas crept steadily closer in its unwavering silence, people recognized a dual sensation, panic intertwined with fascination. It was like staring at a massive doorway opening in the sky, a doorway to something no one could name. Humanity stood on the edge of fear, yet at the same time felt compelled to take one more step forward, compelled to seek an answer. And in that half fear, half curiosity, the world crossed into a new chapter of history. No one dared to name it. Some called it the beginning of a global spiritual crisis. Others claimed it was the first awakening, forcing humanity out of its self-satisfied dream. But all agreed on one thing: the sky had changed, and with it, the human heart could never be the same. Atlas drifted silently through the dark, not yet to explain. Yet it was precisely that silence which fanned the flames of unease, of trembling, of curiosity and dread within humankind, the fire that would consume old assumptions and drive us into a journey no one could predict. When the first wave of shock began to subside, humanity started to see more clearly the distinct faces of the 7 icy torches advancing toward us. Curiosity erupted like a tidal wave, flooding newspapers, laboratories, and even casual conversations on sidewalks. If in idea 1 the world was paralyzed by trembling, then now that trembling had transformed into wide-open eyes, astonished by the bizarre diversity of these 7 celestial bodies, each carrying a story, a journey, and a scar of the universe. People called it the Parade of Ice. Yet no parade had ever left behind such a mix of awe and unease. The first to step onto the cosmic stage was Pan-STARRS, a streak of light that seemed born solely to be seen. Telescopes revealed it shining brilliantly, bright enough to be visible to the naked eye. On social media, long exposure images turned it into a crimson torch, slashing across the heavens like a wound tearing the night apart. But wonder quickly gave way to suspicion. Why was it brighter than it needed to be? Why did its orbit seem chosen so precisely that ordinary eyes could spot it? The excitement of the astronomy community became tinged with doubt. Was this really a coincidence, or had Pan-STARRS been staged to appear at the right time, in the right place? Next came Swan, the uninvited guest, arriving through faint hydrogen signals even before telescopes properly detected it. People likened it to a whisper in the dark, a visitor seated at the table before the host had a chance to invite them in. Experts nodded. Swan's gas activity is so strong it doesn't need sunlight to reveal itself. But that only deepened the public's confusion. Comets usually obeyed, waiting to flare only when warmed, so why was Swan acting as if it already knew the curtain time? Curiosity turned into doubt, and doubt into a feverish hunt for explanations. Then came Stereo, the reckless one. Solar monitoring satellites happened to catch it, plunging into a dangerously tight orbit too close, too hot, too risky. Chances were high it would burn to nothing, but if it survived, it would transform into something completely new. The astonishment felt like watching a performer hurl themselves into flames just to make the audience scream. But instead of applause, humanity shivered. Why would a performer choose this very moment to stage such a suicidal leap? The first 3 torches alone were enough to leave the world reeling. Yet the questions only grew denser. Why had they all appeared together? Was some unseen hand directing this colossal play? And in the silence, the name Atlas still loomed on the horizon, not part of the native cast, but the most unpredictable spectator of all. If the first 3 torches had left humanity breathless, then the next 4 names turned the sky into an overcrowded stage, as if someone kept tossing more pieces onto a game board already bursting at the seams. And here, curiosity turned into a whirlwind. People watched with excitement, yet trembled as if every new arrival carried a hidden code. Atlas K1, was the one that left people deflated. When it was first discovered, early calculations promised it would become the comet of the century, a torch so bright it could outshine familiar stars. But in reality, it fell short of those expectations. Not luminous enough to stir the naked eye, only faintly visible to those patient with binoculars. Yet that disappointment didn't extinguish curiosity, on the contrary, it ignited a quiet suspicion. Why did it appear this year, at this exact moment, when 6 other torches were also crowding the heavens? Observers began to whisper. Perhaps K1's value wasn't in its light, but in its presence, as a necessary piece to complete the picture. Right after K1 came Atlas G3, which made the whole world pause. It was discovered by the same survey system as its sibling, K1, the cold lenses in Hawaii originally built to track impact threats. The surprise wasn't only that the 2 siblings emerged in the same year, but that the coincidence created an eerie echo. Has some secret watchtower just flipped a switch on the entire sky? Skeptics began asking, if the same system kept catching these icy fragments clustering together, could it be that the system itself was inadvertently opening a doorway directing our gaze at the very moment Atlas the interstellar wanderer was about to pass through? Then came Lemon, the one who arrived in the middle, like an ellipsis. Not dazzling, not too faint, it stood in the middle ground, making people feel as if someone had placed it there deliberately to hold the rhythm of the entire symphony. Lemon's appearance sparked no cheering, but its very fittingness made things more suspicious. Some commentators described it as a pawn standing upright on a chessboard. Small, modest, but precise to a chilling degree. Debates flared. Could this be part of a hidden mathematical arrangement? If so, who was writing the formula? Finally came Neat, the veteran of the group. It had been discovered decades ago, its orbit charted clearly, leaving no room for surprises, and yet its presence in the festival of 2025 left the public even more unsettled. A body known long in advance, showing up right on schedule, now perfectly aligned with 6 other unexpected guests. The feeling was like accepting an invitation to a casual gathering, only to discover everyone else was there too, though no one had agreed beforehand. According to experts, the probability of such a coincidence was so low it strained belief. And when the 7 names finally stood aligned in a single row on orbital charts, humanity's emotions split in 2. On one side, sheer astonishment, as if beholding the most magnificent astronomical tableau ever painted. On the other, a gnawing suspicion that an invisible hand was pulling every curve like the strings of a puppet. In every press briefing, the name Atlas, the one that did not belong to the Sun's family, kept echoing, like a reminder that these 7 visitors might be nothing more than the prologue to the arrival of a far more fearsome protagonist. When the list of 7 guests was finally complete, astronomers began stacking the data. They placed orbital paths side by side, comparing every parameter, inclination, eccentricity, and the exact timing of perihelion, and in that moment, curiosity swelled into a wave of astonishment that left the scientific community breathless. The gleaming curves on the screens were no longer sterile numbers. They looked like 7 notes, suddenly rising in the same chord, forming a symphony no one had expected. A few researchers whispered, "Too beautiful to be a coincidence." The public, watching those graphs broadcast on television, could not hold back their gasps. What looked like chaotic arcs overlapped and embraced each other, converging in the narrow window of 2025. Online, people stitched together images into 7 streaks of light aligned in formation, 7 radiant swords raised before Earth. That wonder carried a near-religious enchantment. Was the sky sending humanity a message in images instead of words? Yet the longer they gazed, the more that enchantment fractured into cracks of doubt. If the 7 comets were truly independent guests, why did they all converge into such a narrow window? Why was a phenomenon normally rare over decades, even centuries, happening all at once? And the greatest question of all, why did this coincide precisely with the arrival of 3I divided by Atlas the Wanderer from beyond the solar system? At international conferences, that question was repeated dozens of times, but no one dared provide a definitive answer. Experts patiently explained, this could be the result of millions of years of collisions and orbital disturbances in the outer solar system. Yet those explanations sounded less like reassurance for the public and more like an attempt to reassure themselves. Some scientists, usually cautious, began to stumble. A few careless phrases were quoted in headlines. If this is a coincidence, then it's a coincidence with calculation. And thus, the wave of suspicion spread further. The public began to compare. Atlas was no local comet. It had come from far away, carrying absolute silence. Could the 7 comets be its entourage, dancers choreographed to accompany the grand entrance of the interstellar guest? That question circulated across forums, unsettling even those who placed their trust firmly in science. For though no evidence existed, the image of 7 overlapping orbits and a single alien trajectory entering from afar painted a picture too suggestive, too synchronized for people to easily dismiss. And then a new phrase was born, spreading with the speed of a virus: the staged parade. No one knew who first uttered it, but within days it was on newspaper headlines, social media hashtags, and even whispered in daily conversations. It carried both overwhelming awe and simmering suspicion. If this was a play, then who was the director? And humanity, were we the audience, or the puppets on the strings? When the phrase, the staged parade, exploded worldwide, the media was no longer just a channel for data updates. It became a furnace-melting collective emotion. Every TV channel, every podcast, every viral video served as a mirror, reflecting both overwhelming curiosity and profound bewilderment. People sat for hours in front of screens, not only to track where the comets were headed, but to search for the meaning behind it all. Evening talk shows invited renowned scientists, and in those live debates, emotions ran so high that audiences held their breath. One side insisted this was a mere statistical coincidence, emphasizing that the universe is vast and rare events are inevitable. The other side shook their heads, arguing that the synchronization itself was proof of an invisible conductor orchestrating the symphony of 7 torches. The more they debated, the more people leaned toward the second view, not out of certainty, but because it resonated with humanity's instinct to find patterns. On social media, the chaos was even greater. Thousands of accounts claiming to be independent researchers released charts, video analyses, and 3D models showing the 7 comets circling an invisible center. And when someone added the trajectory of 3I divided by Atlas at the core of that image, the public erupted. For many, this was no longer a coincidence, but a code slowly being decoded. Atlas was the nucleus, and the 7 comets were satellites orbiting around it. Confusion thickened. In classrooms, children asked teachers, if Atlas controls the 7 comets, is it alive or a machine? In cafes, heated arguments broke out. Is this a message of peace or a warning? The entire world felt like a vast auditorium where billions of people were at once amazed, suspicious, and too restless to sit still. And then, irony struck. A group of astronomers released an analysis showing no evidence that these comets were under any unusual influence. Their orbits still followed the normal laws of gravity. That cold data felt like a bucket of water thrown onto the fire of paranoia. Yet instead of extinguishing it, the blaze only grew larger. For humanity despises emptiness. When science said, nothing unusual, the public heard, there's something but they're hiding it. Emotions overlapped in a tangled storm. Curiosity kept people glued to the sky. Wonder made them marvel at the strange beauty of 7 streaks of light, but doubt and confusion dragged them into the abyss of unanswered theories. Across the planet, humanity suddenly felt like a child standing before a locked door, desperate to fling it open, yet terrified of what might be waiting inside. And just beyond that door, the name Atlas lingered silently, neither affirming nor denying, like a colossal question mark stretched across the heavens. In the final days of October, the sky became a vast stage where 7 streaks of light performed at once. Amateur photographers left their cameras running through the night, and each image shared online sent waves of astonishment across the world. One photo captured Pan-STARRS glowing crimson, like a blood-red fracture tearing across the black-blue sky. Another caught Swan encircled by a hydrogen halo, shimmering like a crown of light. Stereo, on the verge of disintegration, flared brilliantly, like a firework ready to sacrifice itself. Even Lemon and Neat, once dismissed as modest, contributed to the portrait, completing a formation so precise it defied belief. People watched with breathless curiosity. Never before in modern history had millions raised their eyes to the heavens, with the sense that they were witnessing something utterly without precedent. From the Sahara Desert to the California coast, from Hawaii's volcanoes to Mongolia's grasslands, all eyes converged on a single spectacle. And in that rare moment, humanity felt as though it had fused into one body, one collective community, swept up in cosmic wonder. But that wonder was far from pure. It was laced, haunted, and muddied by another feeling: doubt. Scientific forums overflowed with data, yet the more data people saw, the more confused they became. Each orbit, each point of light, instead of clarifying, only amplified the questions pounding louder in everyone's minds. Why all at once? Why now? Why with Atlas present? These questions echoed like the roll of drums, transforming sweet curiosity into a gnawing undercurrent of unease. Articles tried to celebrate the beauty of the event, but the comment sections beneath them revealed the truth. People could not enjoy the spectacle untainted when suspicion loomed like a shadow. "If this is natural, then it's the universe's cruelest joke," one reader wrote. "If it's not natural, then we are in the hands of some greater force," another replied. Both possibilities were equally terrifying. Behind closed doors, some older scientists finally admitted that even they were no longer sure. One confessed, "I've watched the skies for 40 years. I've never seen a year like this. I cannot bring myself to call it a coincidence." That admission leaked out and quickly ignited public debate once more. The world now hung suspended between two poles, enchanting wonder and crushing suspicion. In that climate, the name 3I divided by Atlas was spoken more than ever. It was not one of the seven, yet its presence loomed like a dark shadow cast across the stage. All eyes were fixed on the comets, but deep down, everyone understood the true protagonist was Atlas. The seven torches were merely an overture. The interstellar visitor was the centerpiece of the play, and it was Atlas's absolute silence, silence so unnerving it seemed alive, that transformed the entire parade into a colossal enigma. As Idea 2 closed, the world was left in a strange state, dazzled by beauty never before seen, yet staggering under the weight of suspicion. Humanity was shifting from curiosity to bewilderment, from wonder to unease, and in that fragile soil, Idea 3 was ready to rise, to confront why none of this was normal. In the first days of November 2025, just as humanity had grown accustomed to looking up at the seven icy torches burning across the night sky, an unexpected truth struck like lightning. This was not normal at all. At first, people thought they were simply witnessing a brilliant comet season, a rare and beautiful display in astronomy. But the more data was released, the more experts spoke out, the more overwhelming the realization became. Not overwhelming because of beauty, but because of absurdity. Normally, in a fortunate year, there might be one or two comets bright enough to be seen with the naked eye. Some years, the entire astronomy community would wait in vain, rewarded only with a faint streak, visible solely to the most patient telescope watchers. Yet in 2025, the sky had turned into a stage for 7 comets appearing almost at once, a number unmatched in modern records. Experts calculated the odds and found them so low as to be virtually zero. They announced to the public, "If this phenomenon is truly random, then we've just won the cosmic lottery not once, but 7 times in a row." That statement was like a slap to society's fragile calm. Shock rippled through every layer of the world. People were awestruck not only by the rarity, but by the sheer impossibility of it, an improbability that shook their faith in what they once called an indifferent universe. If everything was supposed to be ruled by mathematics, why had this year shattered the rulebook? The dazzling beauty above became a fracture in the human heart, a crack opening into an abyss of doubt. In international meeting halls, dense charts of plotted points filled giant screens. The orbital curves looked like strands of red thread woven tightly together, all converging on the same narrow window of time. Veteran scientists, long accustomed to the arrogance of numbers, now admitted with trembling voices, "We have never seen a cluster of comets converge this tightly in thousands of years of records." And whenever they repeated the name 3I divided by Atlas, the stranger from beyond the solar system, the atmosphere grew even heavier. This simultaneous arrival could not simply be brushed aside with the word coincidence. For the public, the sense of awe was even more crushing. They looked up and realized they were living in a year that would be etched forever into the history of astronomy. But that pride didn't last. Immediately after the wonder came the relentless questions. If this isn't normal, then why? If it isn't chance, then who or what is holding the reins? The miraculous beauty had become a blinding mystery, forcing humanity to look upward in marvel, even as they bowed their heads under the weight of uneasy contemplation. The more statistics were analyzed, the more blatant the absurdity became. Databases stretching back to the 18th century revealed that over more than 200 years, On average, only once every 10 to 15 years would a comet appear bright enough for the naked eye to easily see. Even in years considered special, it was rare to have more than 2 comets visible at once. Yet in 2025, the number 7 landed like a punch in the face of classical logic. It didn't just double or triple the anomaly, it shattered every conventional scale altogether. When these charts were presented at an astronomy conference in Geneva, the entire hall fell silent. No applause, no sighs, just a heavy, suffocating stillness. Everyone understood. If the probability was that close to zero, then humanity was staring at some hidden mechanism no one had ever uncovered. Some experts tried to lighten the mood with metaphors. If each comet is a lottery ticket, then this year we've hit the jackpot 7 times in a row. But instead of laughter, the comparison sent chills down spines. No one believed in a universe generous enough to hand out such extravagant gifts. The astonishment deepened when compared with the Sun's activity cycle. The year 2025 marked the peak of a new solar cycle, with massive sunspots and plasma storms sweeping across space. Normally, this would bring dazzling auroras and minor signal disruptions. But by strange coincidence, it was precisely at this time that 7 comets appeared together. Astrophysicists began to wonder, could the Sun's fluctuating magnetic field have inadvertently acted like a net, drawing wandering celestial bodies into the same period? Yet that question immediately opened a vicious circle. If it were the Sun's magnetic field, why had nothing like this ever occurred before, even though solar cycles had repeated dozens of times? If not the Sun, then what force had triggered it? And why did it happen during this cycle, just when humanity finally had the technology to observe it in such detail? The uncertainty became a scratch across science's pride. We thought we understood the universe, but the truth might be the complete opposite. In cafes, people pointed to charts printed in newspapers and asked each other, is this the hand of nature or the trace of intelligence? On online forums, millions of discussions circled the same question. If this is a signal, what does it mean? And somewhere in the background, the name 3 divided by Atlas echoed like a ghost. For while the 7 comets stunned humanity with their improbability, Atlas the stranger from beyond turned the entire event into an even more confounding riddle. As the flood of numbers kept coming, the theory of mere coincidence began to collapse. At first, it was still strong enough to reassure the public. The universe is vast, and randomness can give rise to strange phenomena. But the more data was released, the more orbital simulations were run on supercomputers, the more that belief cracked. Because if we call this coincidence, then we are using language to mask our helplessness, not to explain the truth. The sense of awe reached its peak when an international research team published a probability analysis. The chance of 7 comets appearing in the same year, while simultaneously intersecting with the trajectory of an interstellar object like 3 divided by Atlas, was less than 1 in a billion. That figure left the packed conference hall in stunned silence. 1 in a billion, meaning that if the universe's history were rewound billions of years, such a moment might never occur again. Suddenly, people felt as though they were living inside a one-of-a-kind experiment, a performance staged exclusively for this generation, never to be repeated. And that uniqueness made humanity lift its head in pride while shuddering with dread. Across media channels, the phrase 1 in a billion became the new slogan. It appeared in editorials, in viral memes, even in opportunistic advertisements. Yet instead of sparking joy, it felt like a mirror reflecting absurdity with cruel clarity. People were overwhelmed because the universe no longer seemed like the indifferent expanse they once imagined. It now appeared to be playing an uncanny game of puzzle-making right before their eyes. And while the public was intoxicated by the sky's haunting beauty, experts sank deeper into unease. An astrophysicist in Tokyo exclaimed, "We can't keep calling this a coincidence. If we do, we're only lying to ourselves." A colleague in Europe added, "If it's not a coincidence, then it must be a mechanism." But what mechanism, when every gravitational force, every Keplerian law, still shows nothing unusual? These questions didn't just shake the scientific community, they planted in the public an unbearable thirst for answers. Online, people began speaking of a giant unknown. Some compared the 7 comets to letters, Atlas to a punctuation mark, and the entire sky to a sentence still unfinished. Curiosity erupted into a tidal wave. Everyone wanted to decode it immediately, to tear away the veil of mystery tonight. But the heavens remained silent, leaving only cold, glowing trails across the dark, as if mocking humanity's helplessness. And it was in that very moment that the world collectively realized this anomaly could no longer be dismissed with excuses. It forced us to confront a deeply unsettling possibility that there are laws of the universe still far beyond the reach of human intelligence. In the days after the phrase, 1 in a billion, rang out, the world spun into a whirlwind of theories. From scientific conference rooms to tiny corner cafes, people scrambled to craft explanations. One hypothesis claimed that an ancient collision in the Kuiper belt had flung multiple fragments inward at once, and 2025 just happened to be the year they appeared together. On the surface, it sounded plausible, but a few simple calculations shattered it. Debris like that could never maintain such perfect synchronization over millions of years. Another theory suggested that the sun's magnetic field, in its chaotic phase, had the power to draw wandering comets into the same time frame. But when compared with previous solar cycles, no similar event had ever been recorded. And so this explanation too fell apart, leaving behind a bitter aftertaste. Hypotheses rose like crashing waves, only to break and dissolve instantly, leaving behind a vast ocean of confusion. This lingering uncertainty unsettled even the scientific community. Articles that once spoke with confidence now resorted to cautious phrasing. Possibly, requires further observation, insufficient data. But that very caution only fueled the public's obsession. They didn't hear prudence, they heard avoidance. For millions who were staring at the night sky, those gaps in scientific language were invitations, gateways for the imagination to soar. Online forums quickly flooded with speculation. Perhaps, some suggested, there was an invisible hand orchestrating the scene. Perhaps the 7 comets weren't random celestial bodies at all, but signals, characters, in a language written by an intelligence beyond humankind. Others argued that 3I divided by Atlas itself was the period at the end of that sentence, a foreign symbol inserted into the native script of our solar system. The public was no longer satisfied with merely watching. They demanded answers, thirsted for explanations. Curiosity transformed into a kind of psychological crisis. With every day that passed without a discovery, people grew restless, as if they were missing out on something monumental. And in that thirst, conspiracy theories multiplied like wildfire, that world governments already knew the truth, that Atlas was an artificial construct, that the 7 comets were being guided by a hidden signal. The bitter irony was that the more theories circulated, the murkier the truth became. Humanity was like a wanderer dying of thirst in the desert, seeing mirages everywhere they turned. This prolonged uncertainty did not cool the awe, it only made it heavier. The universe now felt like a book thrown open halfway, forcing humanity to keep reading without any translation in hand. November came to a close, but the psychological tremor had not subsided. Each night, as the 7 streaks of light swept across the sky in unison, people no longer looked up simply to marvel. They looked up with unease, asking, "Are we staring at a law that has never been written down?" That question echoed like the background score of the entire planet, making every town, every city, every village share the same heavy rhythm of breath. The scientists, instead of offering explanations, began releasing reports with modest titles. The anomaly of 2025. They no longer dared to call it a phenomenon, nor did they dare to insist it was a coincidence. They only knew one thing for certain. 7 comets were not supposed to appear together, but they had. And 3I divided by Atlas, the outsider guest, had chosen this exact moment to pass through. The shock deepened, because if it was all a coincidence, then coincidence had played a cruel trick on human logic. In discussions, a new concept gradually surfaced, the undiscovered law. Some argued that the universe operates on cycles humanity has yet to recognize. Others believed it was a signal, a knock at the door from an extraterrestrial intelligence. And some admitted openly, "We don't know, and that not knowing is the only truth we have." Yet regardless of the interpretation, the shared feeling was still awe. Awe because, for the first time in centuries, humanity felt absolutely small. Skyscrapers, financial centers, modern technologies, all of it suddenly seemed like children's toys compared to the cosmic symphony reverberating in the sky. The astonishment was no longer a fleeting moment. It became a prolonged state. Each morning, humanity woke, looked up, and realized they had never truly understood the world they lived in. And that very astonishment gave birth to a burning form of curiosity. People no longer wanted only to know what had happened. They wanted to know why it had happened. That curiosity did not stop at books or data. It seeped into dreams, into hushed conversations before sleep, into the wide eyes of children asking their parents about the sky. Humanity had entered a strange new phase, trembling with unease, yet driven by an irresistible urge to search for answers. The world had never been so united in its collective bewilderment, and as the name Atlas continued to drift silently across every headline, every newsfeed, it hung there like a suspended exclamation mark never falling, yet powerful enough to shake the entire narrative. People knew they were standing before something that was not normal, something that demanded the rewriting of old pages, and one haunting question lingered. Like the final drumbeat, had we reached the threshold of a cosmic law that had long hidden in the dark? By the end of 2025, the night sky was no longer a place of stillness or of familiar stars. It had become a vast stage, where every movement made millions of hearts tighten in their chests. After the stunning shock of those impossible numbers, humanity entered a new phase, a phase of suspense, tension, and a fog of doubt hanging heavy over the world. People no longer saw the 7 comets as random phenomena, but as chess pieces being moved by the hand of an anonymous player. And the very thought that an invisible hand, a power, or a mechanism might be orchestrating it all sent a chill through humanity, a chill so sharp it stole their breath. Inside the control rooms of NASA, ESA, and JAXA, glowing screens filled with thousands of numbers. The orbits of the 7 comets appeared like crimson threads, crisscrossing, converging within a fragile window of time. Experts repeated the same refrain. There is no evidence of any foreign force. All trajectories follow Newton's laws. And yet, the way they emphasized the phrase, "no evidence," left entire halls silent. Because when a scientist must insist too often that nothing unusual is happening, listeners begin to suspect the opposite, that something is being left unsaid. Doubt seeped into every crack, clung to every word. Suspense spread like an invisible disease. The media called it the universe's secret symphony, where the 7 comets seemed like 7 musicians playing to a melody humanity could not hear. But behind that imagined music, people pictured an unseen hand tapping out the rhythm, guiding every motion. That image repeated itself until it became haunting. The universe no longer a cold clockwork machine, but a play directed by an invisible stagehand. And that feeling, both suspenseful and eerie, robbed humanity of sleep. Doubt soon escaped the laboratories and flooded the streets. All over the world, people whispered that the comets were not just chunks of ice and rock, but signs, perhaps even messages. Some compared them to 7 dancers appearing together on stage, while Atlas the stranger from beyond stood apart, unmoving, watching the performance. And it was Atlas's silence that suffocated them most. A body from another star system drifted past without a signal, without deviation, doing nothing. Yet its very stillness felt like a stranger entering a crowded room, folding his arms, saying nothing. Everyone in the room could feel it, that silence was more terrifying than a scream. The weight of doubt grew heavier. People longed for the invisible hand to reveal itself, to give them an answer, to prove they weren't abandoned in a cold universe. But at the same time they trembled at the thought, if there truly was a hidden power, what did it want? Was it testing, warning, or simply observing humanity like insects in a jar? And if no such power existed, if all this was mere coincidence, then that truth was even more terrifying. For it meant everything humanity felt was an illusion, that they had deceived themselves with their own fear. In that space, disappointment crept in. Press conferences that had promised answers delivered only vague reassurances. People sat before their screens, waiting for a breakthrough discovery, but instead heard the same phrases repeated. More data needed, no conclusions yet. Each time, public trust fractured further. People wondered bitterly, was science just as powerless before the cosmos, just as abandoned as those staring helplessly at the sky? And so, suspended between suffocating suspense and relentless doubt, humanity entered a strange state, desperate to know, yet afraid of the answer. Atlas continued its silent drift through the dark, offering no clues. But it was precisely that silence that stretched suspense into infinity, layered doubt like waves of the sea, and let disappointment bleed quietly into every gaze fixed on the heavens. After weeks of tension, the wave of doubt had grown so vast that nothing could stop it. Theories sprouted like mushrooms after rain, ranging from serious to absurd, flooding the public space. Everywhere, From international scientific conferences to corner cafe tables, people scrambled to build explanations for the anomaly. And it was precisely this chaotic diversity that made the atmosphere even heavier. Instead of offering answers, it only sowed deeper disappointment. The first theory to capture attention was the idea of a massive, undiscovered object, a hidden shepherd lurking at the edge of the solar system. The press quickly gave it a dramatic name, the rebirth of Planet X. The public shivered at the thought, picturing a dark planet out there, quietly pulling the strings of 7 comets like a puppeteer. For a few days, the idea dominated headlines, but when telescopes swept the skies, no trace appeared. Only emptiness replied. Planet X was struck off the list, leaving behind the hollow aftertaste of a drumbeat cut short. The second theory came from the United States, suggesting that the Sun's chaotic magnetic field during the 2025 cycle had generated a cosmic storm strong enough to herd the comets into the same time frame. At first, many nodded along. It sounded reasonable. The Sun was the heart of the system. Why couldn't it also act as the conductor of the orchestra? Yet history shattered the notion. Dozens of solar cycles had raged before, none producing a simultaneous parade like this. And so that theory collapsed, leaving another unfilled void. Then came bolder, even taboo-breaking proposals. What if an extraterrestrial civilization had intervened? Could they have nudged cometary orbits like chess pieces, arranging a colossal performance designed to force humanity to look up? The mainstream scientific community fiercely rejected the notion. Major research institutes insisted there was no evidence of artificial interference, but the public clung to it like a drowning person clutching driftwood. To their eyes, the perfect silence of 3i divided by Atlas resembled indirect proof, an alien visitor standing still, watching, neither confirming nor denying. Yet fresh data once again dismantled the hope. The orbits of all 7 comets matched Kepler's laws perfectly, with no sign of tampering. The extraterrestrial theory, once a lifeline for millions, was pushed aside. This time, the disappointment didn't just come from scientists, but from ordinary people as well. They felt betrayed, abandoned in the darkness of ignorance. Each theory had sparked fragile hope, only to collapse like a sandcastle. In classrooms, students asked their teachers, "If there's no explanation, then what are you teaching us?" At family dinners, adults whispered, "Maybe we'll never know the truth." Online, millions of comments circled a shared ache, the gnawing sense that humanity had reached an invisible wall separating them from the deeper laws of the cosmos. Science, once the lighthouse, now flickered like a candle in the wind. Press conferences declaring no conclusion yet felt like sand slipping through fingers. The tighter one tried to hold, the faster it was lost. The public sat before their screens, yearning for a breakthrough discovery, but received only heavy silence. People asked themselves, if even science is powerless, what is left for us to believe in? And in that darkness, Atlas drifted, still silent, unmoving. It did not answer, did not change course, did not soothe, did not threaten, but its silence itself became a curse, forcing humanity to chew on doubt, disappointment, and a kind of existential restlessness never before seen in history. As the days slipped by, the strain of waiting hardened into a vast, suffocating disappointment. Press conferences, once anticipated as the place where answers might finally emerge, had devolved into repetitive rituals, tedious to the point of pain. Each time a spokesperson stepped up to the podium, millions of people watched from their screens, hoping for a sliver of revelation. But the words were always the same. Insufficient data. More time is needed. We cannot conclude yet. Each phrase felt like a cold nail hammered into the door of hope. The entire planet sank into the sensation of being let down, as if waiting for a symphony's crescendo only to hear sour, broken notes. That disappointment seeped into daily life, saturating every corner of society. In classrooms, children raised their eyes and asked their teachers, "Why 7? Why all at once?" Teachers, once the trusted guides, could only answer with silence or vague reassurances. At dinner tables, where laughter once filled the air, only sighs could be heard. Maybe we'll never know. On social media, the comments stacked into a wall of lament. The universe is mocking us. People felt deeply that their faith in knowledge, the pillar of their identity, was beginning to crack within their very souls. Governments tried to revive confidence with international summits. Leaders of powerful nations appeared on television, calling for unity, declaring that science will not abandon humanity. Yet behind the slogans, helplessness was plain. Scientific delegations presented thick reports, but page after page only confirmed what everyone already knew. 7 comets appearing at once was abnormal, and Atlas continued its silent drift. Everything stopped short of emphasizing the unknown. No one dared to name a cause. The summits ended with polite applause, but the world knew it was only a curtain covering paralysis. Even the scientists themselves could not escape the spiral. Behind closed doors, some admitted in heavy voices, "We've never seen anything like this. Perhaps we will never explain it." Those confessions leaked out, further shaking the public. If even the sharpest minds, the ones considered humanity's guiding lights, bowed their heads in defeat, then what could anyone else cling to? In this expanding wave of disappointment, the questions grew larger. They no longer revolved solely around the 7 comets, but around humanity itself. Philosophers, sociologists, and even ordinary people began to ask, is our intelligence truly enough to grasp the universe, or are we merely children fumbling to read a book far beyond our reach? Doubt, which at first targeted only the sky's phenomena, now turned inward, illuminating the limits of our own species. That realization kept many awake at night, because they saw that the greatest fear was not the comets or Atlas, but the possibility that we might never understand at all. Atlas, silent as a stranger standing in the midst of a loud banquet, grew ever more haunting. It sent no signals, altered no orbit, confirmed or denied nothing, and yet, that very silence transformed it into the ultimate emblem of emptiness. Humanity kept looking up, waiting, disappointed, restless, while Atlas drifted on in stillness, leaving behind a colossal question mark suspended in the sky at year's end. As winter settled over the northern hemisphere in 2025, humanity entered the most intense stage of its crisis of understanding. The long, freezing nights made the skies sharper, clearer, and the 7 streaks of light, along with the silent shadow of 3 divided by Atlas, appeared more vivid than ever. People no longer looked at them as astronomical phenomena, but as symbols, as ciphers waiting to be decoded. Anticipation surged in every gaze. Would tonight bring change? Would Atlas emit a signal? Would one of the 7 torches veer off in an unexpected direction? Every passing moment felt like another tug on the taut nerve of collective consciousness. And yet, day after day, the answer remained the same. Silence. No signals, no deviations, no explanations. Atlas continued its cold trajectory. The 7 comets kept to their steady paths. The anticipation did not dissipate. It was compressed, like a drum roll that never struck its final note. That silence, instead of reassuring, only deepened suspicion. Are we being tested? Is someone out there watching our reaction? In philosophical discussions, many scholars began to describe the entire phenomenon as a vast mirror. The universe was not providing answers, it was forcing humanity to confront its own reflection. The anticipation, the suspicion, the disappointment, they were not coming from the comets or Atlas, but from humanity's inner projection. We longed for meaning, yet the universe remained silent. And within that silence lay our greatest fear, that there was no invisible hand at all, that everything we imagined was nothing more than the projection of ourselves. The unease no longer belonged only to scientists or the curious, it seeped into every soul. Churches held prayer gatherings larger than ever before, with pleas rising into the night. If this is a message, please let us understand. Artists turned the phenomenon into paintings, music, poetry, but all carried the same undercurrent, unease without resolution. Philosophers wrote essays hundreds of pages long, but by the final paragraph, readers found the same question repeated. Are we part of a play without knowing our role? The lack of answers bred despair. Yet at the same time, it ignited a new hunger. The hunger to go beyond our limits. If current science was not enough, perhaps another language, another system of knowledge, was needed to comprehend. If the 7 comets and Atlas were not a coincidence, then they were forcing humanity to expand the doors of thought. The question was no longer, where did they come from, but what are they making us become? At that very moment, humanity began to grasp that anticipation. Suspicion, disappointment, and unease were not passing feelings. They were the raw material for building a new dialogue between humanity and the cosmos. Atlas offered no response, the 7 comets no explanation. But within that silence, a philosophical doorway opened. We must learn to live with questions that have no answer. And so, as 2025 came to a close, the sky still blazed with comet trails, Atlas still cut across in cold indifference. There was no revelation, no grand finale. Yet in humanity's heart, a lesson etched itself deeply. Sometimes the invisible hand does not appear to hold us, but simply to remind us that we must face the vastness of the unknown ourselves. And within that very unease, humanity stepped into a new chapter not with answers, but with growth. At the dawn of 2026, the night sky still blazed with the long trails of comets, and Atlas continued its silent passage through the heavens, wrapped in absolute quiet. Yet after months of drowning in doubt and disappointment, humanity's state of mind began to shift. The shock had passed, the helplessness had sunk in, and now a new emotion surfaced: vigilance. People realized that even without answers, they could not remain frozen in the whirlpool of theories and endless waiting. If the universe was sending a message, whether literal or symbolic, humanity no longer had the right to turn away. Governments that once held only conferences began launching concrete response programs. They established interdisciplinary task forces, linking data from every telescope, satellite, and observation station. Some cities even drafted emergency measures, testing asteroid defense systems, auditing food reserves, and running evacuation drills. These actions did not arise from blind panic, but from the sober awakening that the worst-case scenario could not be ruled out. And in that very stance, serious, even grave, there was also a spark of new energy. Humanity, instead of sitting idle, was beginning to rise and face the unknown. The global media also shifted its tone. Where, in the previous year, headlines overflowed with awe and fear, now reporters wielded sharper, more urgent words, alarm bells instead of wonder. This is no longer the business of astronomers alone. This is the business of the entire planet. Editorials urged citizens not to gaze at the heavens as mere spectators, but to act, to join the worldwide conversation. Each line struck like an arrow at the heart of millions. The silence of Atlas and the strangeness of the 7 comets were not just data points, but a test of humanity's ability to unite and respond. This sense of vigilance was not the same as despair. On the contrary, it carried a strange exhilaration, the thrill of realizing one was standing in a pivotal chapter of history. People flocked to public observation gatherings, setting up telescopes in city squares, speaking to one another as comrades rather than strangers. Schools organized special astronomy classes, where children not only learned Newton's laws, but also debated the philosophical meaning of the events unfolding above. The atmosphere, at once solemn and vibrant, felt like a rehearsal for the spirit of humankind. And yet, alongside this new sense of purpose, suspicion crept in. Many asked, were these precautions truly necessary, or merely a political theatre? Were governments exploiting the phenomenon to expand their power, to tighten control over society? And was science itself withholding data that the public had no access to? Such questions echoed everywhere, ensuring that vigilance was never pure. It always carried with it the shadow of mistrust, as if humanity was not only bracing for a cosmic threat, but also guarding against the invisible hands of its own institutions. In this double-edged atmosphere, Atlas continued its quiet drift. No signal, no deviation, no reply. But that very silence gave weight to humanity's actions. We were no longer waiting for the universe to hand us a message. We were beginning to train ourselves in awareness, in readiness. And perhaps that was the truest wake-up call, not from the 7 comets, not from Atlas, but from our own response to the unexplainable. It did not take long for this new vigilance to escape the walls of governments and spread into a global movement. Across the planet, small communities began organizing initiatives of their own. In South America, farmers gathered in village squares, bringing battered telescopes and old cameras, watching the heavens together as if it were a sacred ritual. In Africa, villages blended prayer circles with public forums, where elders retold ancient legends of sky torches to connect myth and memory with the burning strangeness of the present. In Asia, universities launched astronomical vigilance clubs, opening their doors to both students and ordinary citizens, where lectures on orbital mechanics alternated with late-night debates on humanity's responsibility before the cosmos. The atmosphere was tense, but it crackled with energy. From school children to factory workers, from monks to business leaders, everyone felt as if they were part of a vast experiment. The sense of participating, of sharing, of waking up together, stirred a rare form of collective excitement. For the first time in decades, people from distant cultures felt they were reading the same book, turning the same pages, and lifting their eyes toward the same sky. In that fragile yet radiant moment, humanity tasted a kind of unity it had long forgotten. And yet, even within unity, suspicion slipped quietly in. Some began to ask, was this vigilance truly born of sincerity, or was it being steered by unseen hands? Non-governmental organizations accused states of exploiting the phenomenon to expand their grip on power. Activists pointed to the normalization of evacuation drills, tightened food controls, and expanded surveillance measures, warning, we cannot allow vigilance to become the excuse for manipulation. Online, debates raged like brushfires. One camp believed this was a golden opportunity for humanity to unite and rehearse its ability to respond to cosmic dangers. The other feared that vigilance was already being twisted, becoming a political tool. These fiery exchanges did not weaken the movement, they deepened it. Vigilance no longer meant merely watching the sky, it also meant watching one another, discerning who acted for the common good and who profited from fear. Within this charged climate, the image of Atlas grew ever more haunting. It did not change, did not shatter its silence, but became the very reason people stayed alert. Community halls hung photographs of Atlas on their walls, using it as a talisman, a constant reminder, do not sleep, something is watching. Public fascination no longer rested on the eerie beauty of the comets, but on the conviction that they were living inside a story larger than themselves, a story in which every action and every choice might matter. And yet, beneath the surface, doubt glowed like embers under ash. Many began to ask, if all of this is truly random, are we not fooling ourselves? Are we turning a natural event into a stage for power plays and illusions of meaning? Such questions had no answers, but they ensured that the movement could never remain pure. Vigilance itself became double-edged at once, a light that guided and a shadow that warned. Be alert, not only to the mysteries of the universe, but also to the hidden hands within humanity. Once the vigilance movement had rooted itself into nearly every corner of daily life, it quickly erupted into a wave of global action. Scientific, military, and cultural projects were launched at a pace never before seen, as if humanity had collectively heard an alarm bell echoing deep within their bones. In the United States and Europe, space agencies accelerated the construction of next-generation telescopes capable of detecting even the faintest objects lurking at the edge of the solar system. Across Asia, community observatories rose within months, transforming quiet mountain peaks into bustling hubs of astronomy. In Africa and South America, schools opened vigilance science programs, teaching children how to read star maps and analyze orbital data. It wasn't only science that moved, militaries shifted as well. Several nations announced plans to cooperate on asteroid defense systems, with ground-based missile arrays and experimental lasers brought into public discussion for the first time. No one dared to claim the 7 comets posed an immediate threat, but the silent presence of Atlas convinced the world that preparation was essential, even for the darkest scenarios. Vigilance was no longer an abstract concept. It was etched into budgets, policies, and national strategies. Meanwhile, the cultural and artistic world experienced an energy unlike anything in living memory. Writers spun science fiction novels around the idea of an invisible hand. Composers debuted symphonies inspired by the 7 comets. Art galleries displayed paintings of Atlas as a colossal eye staring down upon humanity. These creations not only fueled fascination, but also reinforced collective awareness. Humanity was not preparing solely with technology or weaponry, but also with imagination, with stories to keep the flame of vigilance alive. And yet, alongside this eruption of energy, suspicion deepened. Many argued that the scientific projects were nothing more than excuses for tech corporations to swallow greater sums of public funding. Politicians were accused of wielding the comet threat to manipulate opinion and tighten their grip on power. Online, viral videos dissected every word from officials, every chart released, insisting that this vigilance is just another power play. Humanity now stood at a paradox. Never had people acted so decisively, and never had they doubted so fiercely. Every new facility was hailed as an achievement and simultaneously condemned as a cover-up. Every speech calling for vigilance was met with applause and accusations in equal measure. Vigilance had become a double-edged blade. It bound people together while cutting deeper fractures of mistrust. And through all of this debate, Atlas drifted on cold, silent, and unmoving. It confirmed nothing, denied nothing. Yet its stillness gave weight to every project, every initiative, every warning, as if Atlas, without speaking a word, had become a mirror, reflecting humanity's determination, its bursts of creativity, and its widening cracks of suspicion. By March of 2026, after months of emergency meetings and heated debates, the United Nations issued an unprecedented global declaration. Humanity is entering a state of cosmic vigilance. For the first time in history, an international document addressed not war, climate, or economic crisis, but the blazing ice torches streaking across the night sky. The declaration was broadcast live to billions, the spokesperson's voice ringing clear, "We cannot treat this as a spectacle of beauty. We must see it as a test of survival." The moment shook the world. In many cities, crowds erupted in cheers, as if witnessing a major sporting event. Excitement spread quickly, because people felt they were living through a defining chapter of history, a page their descendants would remember. Schools held special ceremonies, replaying the UN's declaration as a lesson in shared responsibility. For the first time, many grasped the true meaning of the phrase, global citizen. But along with this surge of enthusiasm came a wave of suspicion. Analysts immediately questioned whether the warning was genuine or merely political theatre. They pointed out that declaring a state of cosmic vigilance allowed governments to easily expand defense budgets, consolidate power, and impose tighter social controls under the banner of safety. Protest movements ignited, with banners raised high reading, "We are not puppets of the sky's torches." On television, fierce debates played out daily. One side insisted, "We must prepare, because no one knows what the 7 Comets and Atlas will do next." The other side mocked, "We're wasting resources on a science fiction scenario. The universe doesn't care about humanity." These clashing arguments reverberated everywhere, and paradoxically, the very conflict only made the atmosphere of vigilance feel more alive. Humanity became like a single body trembling with unease, yet burning with the thrill of participation. The UN event also cast a spotlight on scientific projects. A new telescope in Chile released breathtaking images of Comet Swan, its gas tail unfurling like a phoenix's wings. The videos spread across the globe, millions sharing them with the caption, "So beautiful, it's dangerous." Beauty was no longer pure, it had become inseparable from vigilance, each dazzling display carrying the weight of foreboding. And yet, beneath every cheer, lingered a whisper of doubt. Some wrote bluntly online, "Are we simply fooling ourselves? Is this vigilance just a collective performance, convincing us that we are in control?" These questions were never answered directly, but they clung stubbornly to humanity's consciousness. High above, Atlas continued its silent passage, offering no signal, no sign. It neither confirmed the world's need for vigilance nor denied it. That silence turned the global declaration into a bell that rang endlessly, without resolution. Humanity found itself more vigilant than ever, yet also haunted by the suspicion that perhaps the only shadow looming over them was the one they had cast upon the sky themselves. As the spring of 2026 approached, the explosion of headlines began to slow. The world was no longer consumed by the frenzy of the early months, but a new condition had taken shape, a state of constant vigilance. Every morning, when the news repeated, "The 7 comets and 3 eye divided by Atlas continue their journey," people no longer trembled, but neither were they indifferent. It was a silence saturated with awareness, like a night watchman who knows danger may never come, yet keeps his eyes open and ears alert to every small sound. Communities gradually learned to turn vigilance into a way of life. In many places, people organized regular observation hours, not only to watch the sky, but to remind each other of humanity's fragility. Families made it a ritual. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch, gazed at the 7 streaks, and spoke with their children about responsibility, about knowledge, about truth. In that repetition, humanity was practicing a form of long-term awareness, not loud, but woven into every breath. The sense of fascination was still there, but it had changed in nature. No longer awe at strange beauty, it had become intellectual curiosity, the fascination of realizing that each person could take part in the search for meaning. Online forums erupted with open courses ranging from basic astronomy to cosmic philosophy. The best-selling books were no longer romance novels or business guides, but volumes on space science and the meaning of existence. Humanity, though still without answers, had begun to find excitement in the act of asking questions. Yet doubt lingered like a shadow. Many argued that the vigilance movement was merely a kind of collective ritual, a way of hiding the truth that we knew no more than we had on day one. Some mocked, "We are worshipping streaks of light as if they were gods, with no evidence they care about us at all." Instead of extinguishing the movement, these voices gave it balance. Humanity was forced to check itself, to be vigilant without fanaticism, curious without blindness. Atlas, as always, drifted in silence. But that very silence became the final lesson of this stage. It taught humanity that not every phenomenon comes with clear answers, and not every alarm bell sounds from the outside. Sometimes vigilance is not born of real danger, but from the fact that not knowing itself is peril enough. And in learning to live with that uncertainty, humanity was compelled to grow. As Idea 5 drew to a close, humanity entered a new state, no longer frantic, no longer ruled by fear, but maintaining a steady, quiet vigilance. The 7 comets and Atlas were still there, mysterious and mute, but beneath that sky, people had changed. They had learned to be watchful not only toward the universe, not only toward power, but toward themselves. And perhaps that was the true bell one that rang not with sound, but with awakening in the collective heart. In the summer of 2026, after months of humanity living in a state of constant vigilance, a discovery made the world erupt. Space telescopes transmitted images of 3I divided by Atlas in unprecedented detail, and what appeared defied every imagination. Before the scientists' eyes was no longer a dull grey lump of ice and rock, but a strange structure, etched with faint luminous veins running along its body like giant glowing blood vessels in the night. Those images spread across the internet within hours, and the entire planet fell into absolute awe. Major news outlets described Atlas as a radiant stranger among the stars. Billions glued their eyes to screens, witnessing the details of an interstellar object that, until now, had only existed in theory. Each streak of light across its surface looked like alien script, a secret language humankind had never learned. The sense of wonder spread like wildfire, as though the universe had torn open the black curtain to reveal a secret never meant for mortal eyes. In laboratories, scientists were stunned by the spectral data. Atlas did not merely reflect sunlight, it emitted a faint infrared spectrum, a phenomenon never before observed in a comet or asteroid. "It's breathing," one researcher exclaimed as he stared at the chart, and within hours the phrase was quoted by millions. Though everyone knew it was only a metaphor, the public shivered at the thought. Atlas, the wanderer from interstellar space, seemed to carry within it a hidden life, or at least a movement beyond the limits of current knowledge. Curiosity blazed. Schools across the globe hastily organized special lessons to explain the phenomenon. Children filled their notebooks with drawings of Atlas, adding eyes or wings, imagining it as a mythic creature. Adults devoured every article, every hypothesis. Questions poured out relentlessly. Who carved those glowing veins? Is it a spacecraft? If there's a language encoded, can we read it? Atlas, once a mute object drifting across the void, had become a secret book that the entire planet was desperate to open. And alongside curiosity came hope, a fragile but dazzling hope. Many believed this could be the first sign of another civilization, or at least a chance for humanity to learn something far beyond its present understanding. In prayer halls, people no longer whispered for protection, but pleaded that Atlas might bring an answer, a clue, a hint of our true place in the cosmos. Each night, the 7 comets still blazed across the heavens, but they no longer consumed the world's imagination. All eyes, all longing, all astonishment converged on Atlas, the interstellar stranger now unveiling its uncanny face. And humanity understood. If this was an invitation, it was the most overwhelming invitation the universe had ever sent. Within just days of the first detailed images of Atlas being released, the world plunged into a storm of debate. Academic, religious, political and cultural forums all revolved around the same burning question. What is Atlas? The glowing veins along its body were magnified, scrutinized pixel by pixel, becoming the subject of endless arguments. Some scientists insisted it was nothing more than a bizarre geological effect, layers of ice and dust reflecting light in peculiar ways. But others, even within the academic community, did not hesitate to suggest that it looked like an artificial structure, a deliberate imprint, something far beyond mere coincidence. The debate spilled onto the streets, transforming into a collective spectacle. Citizens held up placards reading, "Atlas, messenger of the cosmos," or "Atlas is just rock, stop fooling yourselves." Public squares became open-air lecture halls where crowds argued late into the night. Some tapped rhythms on tables to prove the veins followed a pulse-like cycle. Others sketched diagrams to show they were simply crystalline ice patterns. No one would concede, and within that very tension, humanity experienced a kind of collective awe. They were no longer scattered individuals but pieces of a massive conversation about the meaning of the universe. Amid the chaos, curiosity burned like a guiding flame. Research institutes were flooded with volunteer applications to help monitor data. Students flocked to study physics, mathematics, linguistics, anything that might one day allow them to help decode the mystery. Teen competitions sprouted up across the globe with a single prompt. If Atlas could speak, what would it say? The question, seemingly childish, ignited in millions a thirst to know, to reach for something beyond human comprehension. Alongside curiosity came flickers of hope, growing brighter by the day. Hope that Atlas might hold the answer to humanity's oldest question, are we alone? Hope that behind those radiant veins lay a civilization, a mind, a greeting, and if so, Atlas would not be a threat, but a doorway into a new chapter for humankind. Prayers in churches, temples and mosques rose not only for safety but for connection. Let us meet them. Yet not everyone embraced the hopeful narrative. Underneath the excitement lurked unease, mixing exhilaration with caution. If it's a spacecraft, are they benevolent? If it's just a coincidence, are we turning ourselves into a global joke? Such questions ensured the debate never cooled. But paradoxically, that very tug-of-war only amplified the collective awe. Never before had a single extraterrestrial object so deeply shaken the human mind. Meanwhile, Atlas drifted silently along its trajectory, unchanged and mute. It offered no confirmation, no denial, only the lingering enigma of glowing veins upon its surface. And in that silence, humanity began to understand. Sometimes, what overwhelms us is not the answer, but the sheer, boundless power of a question. Before the debates could settle, the race to decode Atlas erupted like a tidal wave. Never before in history had science received such overwhelming investment and attention. Nations once locked in rivalry now found themselves forced to sit at the same table, sharing data, for all understood one truth. Atlas did not belong to anyone. It was an interstellar stranger, and its arrival posed a question for all humanity. A flood of research projects began. The James Webb Space Telescope was reoriented to prioritize Atlas, sending back images so detailed that even the faintest glowing veins on its surface appeared with startling clarity. New spectroscopic data revealed subtle fluctuations in the intensity of that glow, as if the veins were not static at all, but pulsing to some unfathomable rhythm. This could be a physical process unknown to us, or the unfinished sentence of a scientist on live television was enough to make the entire world hold its breath. Curiosity spilled far beyond the laboratory walls. Teams of linguists began attempting to translate Atlas, treating the glowing patterns as though they were an ancient script. Mathematicians searched for repetitions, hoping to uncover a meaningful sequence of numbers. Artists painted abstract canvases inspired by its shimmering body, seeing Atlas itself as a visual message. Every field, every imagination tried to connect itself to the mystery, and that sheer diversity of effort transformed Atlas into a massive center of gravity, pulling the whole planet into its whirlpool of wonder. In the frenzy, hope quietly took root. Some philosophers declared, this may be the moment humanity comes of age, when we are forced to accept that we are no longer the center of the universe. On public squares, young people lifted banners proclaiming, Atlas, our new chapter. Prayer gatherings no longer pleaded only for protection, but overflowed with vows. If Atlas brought knowledge, humankind would learn to use it to change itself. The sense of awe deepened when new data revealed that Atlas's mass was far lighter than calculations based on its size. The discovery stunned researchers, hinting that Atlas might be hollow inside a colossal cavity, or worse, a structure humanity had no name for. Theories spread like wildfire. Some whispered, if it's hollow, perhaps it carries a message. Others shivered. If it's hollow, perhaps it's a machine. Whatever the interpretation, the collective feeling was the same. Awe. Atlas was not merely challenging human intellect, It was twisting the very fabric of human knowledge. Each new dataset closed no questions. It opened hundreds more. And in that endlessness, people felt themselves both diminished and elevated. Diminished because they did not understand, elevated because at last they were touching something beyond imagination. In the sky, Atlas remained silent, sending no signals, altering no trajectory. Yet for humanity, it had already transcended being a mere object. It had become a symbol of the search itself, a symbol of the belief that even within the coldest silence, there may still be the possibility of dialogue. In September 2026, just as the world was beginning to grow accustomed to living with Atlas's mystery, an unexpected phenomenon ignited the atmosphere all over again. The global telescope network simultaneously recorded a sudden flare. For a brief span of less than 10 minutes, the glowing veins across Atlas's body blazed with brilliance many times brighter than usual. The event was fleeting, but every camera captured it, and when the images appeared on screens, humanity once again fell into a state of absolute awe. No one could explain why the veins had suddenly erupted in light. Some argued it was a rare physical process, the venting of gases from a hollow core. Others believed it was an unknown chemical reaction, but to the public, those explanations felt far too thin against such overwhelming mystery. People stared at the screens and gasped. It just spoke. For the first time, humanity felt as though Atlas was no longer wrapped in absolute silence, but had made a gesture, even a fleeting one, that acknowledged its presence. Shock and wonder rippled across the planet. Crowds gathered in public squares, eyes fixed on massive live screens. Many broke down in tears, others dropped to their knees in prayer. Social media is flooded with videos, children clutching their parents, young people raising their arms toward the sky, the elderly whispering ancient prayers. For a brief moment, every doubt and suspicion was swept away, replaced by a collective conviction. We had just witnessed a sign from the interstellar stranger. From that moment, curiosity exploded more fiercely than ever. Research teams rushed to analyze the data, measuring variations in brightness, searching for repeating cycles. Some mathematicians published papers suggesting that the fluctuations followed a suspicious ratio, potentially forming a numerical sequence, perhaps a message. Linguists and cryptographers were enlisted, hoping to decipher the 10-minute light as a short communique from the cosmos. The debate echoed everywhere, from laboratories to coffee shops. Was it random, or was it intentional? Alongside the curiosity came a radiant wave of hope. Many believed Atlas was no longer a silent wanderer but had begun to open the door to dialogue. If those glowing veins truly carried meaning, humanity might be on the brink of witnessing the first great encounter. Religious leaders called the phenomenon the light of revelation. Philosophers named it a greeting in silence, and the public, in their simplicity, called it with one word, a miracle. Of course, cautious voices still lingered. Skeptics argued, it was just a normal gas outburst. Others warned, we're projecting meaning onto nothing. Yet this time, the doubts were not strong enough to overpower the tidal wave of emotion. Too many had witnessed it with their own eyes. Too many hearts had been shaken. In those 10 short minutes, Atlas had etched its name into the collective memory of the blue planet. As the brilliance faded, Atlas returned to its quiet, drifting figure in the endless void. But now, it was no longer just a stranger. It was the one who had once offered a gesture just enough for humanity to believe that behind the silence, an answer might exist. And that belief, fragile as it was, planted a seed of hope unlike any before, that the conversation with the universe may already have begun. After the 10-minute light phenomenon, the global atmosphere was never the same. People no longer looked at Atlas with mere skepticism, but with a feeling that defied easy description, a mix of reverence, admiration, and longing. They no longer saw it as a cold block of alien ice, but as a great guest who had nodded once in the darkness. And from that moment, humanity knew it could never return to its former indifference. A new era had begun. Nations launched programs of unprecedented scale. The Interplanetary Cooperation Organization was founded, linking space agencies, research institutes, and tens of thousands of scientists. The goal was no longer simply to observe, but to prepare for the possibility of dialogue. Bold projects were announced. The development of ultra-powerful radio transmitters, experiments with laser pulses aimed directly at Atlas, and studies on the feasibility of sending a probe to intercept it within a decade. These plans shocked the world not with fear, but with blazing hope. For the first time in history, humanity was not just waiting, but knocking on the gates of the cosmos. Across society, curiosity transformed into cultural momentum. Books about Atlas became instant bestsellers, films inspired by its glowing veins multiplied, and science and art exhibitions drew millions of visitors. Children sketched Atlas with wings, young people composed electronic music based on its light frequencies, while the elderly whispered to each other, "We witnessed a miracle with our own eyes." Every community, every generation contributed a fragment, weaving together a dazzling tapestry of collective wonder. Yet beneath the excitement lay quieter, deeper concerns. Was reaching out too great a risk? Did Atlas truly want to communicate? Or was the luminous flare nothing more than a natural phenomenon? Would humanity's hope collapse into disappointment once again? No one could answer. But strangely, unlike in 2025, ignorance no longer seeded despair. This time, it sowed hope, for if Atlas had once revealed a fleeting gesture, perhaps it might do so again, and again, until one day a true conversation began. Humanity began to practice patience. Each night, when looking up at the sky, people were no longer waiting only for Atlas to change. They were learning to change themselves. They learned to live alongside awe, to nurture curiosity without panic, to keep hope alive even when the universe stayed silent. Atlas, though distant, had become a mirror. It reflected not only the grandeur of the cosmos but the strength of humanity when it dares to believe in something beyond its reach. And so, by the end of 2026, beneath a sky still blazing with 7 comets and Atlas, a message quietly crystallized in the human heart. We are ready, ready not to control, but to listen, ready not to impose, but to converse, ready not only out of curiosity, but out of hope. Hope that in the vast immensity of space, humanity was never truly alone. At the start of 2027, while the memory of the 10-minute light still lingered deeply in humanity's collective mind, Atlas suddenly unveiled a new phenomenon. Telescopes detected that the glowing veins across its body now pulsed with repeating fluctuations of intensity, a steady rhythm, like the beat of some colossal instrument echoing through the void. The discovery shocked the world once again, but this time, the dominant emotion was no longer fear, as it had been in the years before. Instead, humanity was swept into a state of fascination and rapture unlike anything it had ever known. Everywhere on Earth, people rushed to study, discuss, and even enjoy the rhythm of that light. Mathematicians dissected the cycle, searching for symmetry and hidden numerical patterns. Musicians translated the frequencies of the glow into sound, creating surreal electronic compositions that were streamed millions of times online. Children used computer software to render graphics from the data, turning Atlas into a storyteller of light. The entire planet was enchanted, as though the universe had finally begun to sing, and humanity was invited to be its audience. This enchantment was both sweet and dangerous. The more people gazed and listened, the more they became convinced there was intelligence behind the light. Every fluctuation, every beat, turned into a symbol of promise. Some claimed to have found sequences of prime numbers in the oscillations. Others argued that the cycles matched the structure of the ancient Sumerian language. None of these theories had been verified, yet they spread at lightning speed, feeding the public's obsession. And yet, alongside the global intoxication came another feeling: confusion. Leading scientists clashed fiercely. One camp insisted the phenomenon must be natural, perhaps caused by streams of material circulating inside Atlas's hollow core. The other camp countered that the precision of the repetition was far too exact to be a coincidence. Conferences turned into battlegrounds, where not only knowledge but also personal conviction was tested. The public watched live, witnessing even the greatest minds waver and falter, no less anxious than themselves. In cities, coffee shops transformed into makeshift laboratories. Ordinary citizens downloaded open-source data from observatories and analyzed it together with free software. Every time a group announced a discovery, the internet erupted in fiery debate. Phrases like code, language of light, and interstellar symphony became global search trends. It was as if the entire planet had been hypnotized not by fear, but by delight, by immersion, by the intoxicating possibility that humanity was brushing against an intelligence beyond its own. But fascination was always shadowed by unease. If there truly was an intelligence behind the pulsing glow, what did it want? Was it a greeting? Or was it an experiment? a test in which humanity had unwittingly volunteered as the subject. No answer came, but the question itself only deepened the hunger to know. Anxiety did not extinguish belief. It made belief burn hotter, like a flame trembling in the wind yet still shining fiercely. And high above, Atlas continued to drift, to shine, to beat its rhythm in the darkness. It offered no promises, no explanations, no confirmation. Yet to humanity, each pulse had become the heartbeat of an interstellar stranger, and the hearts of humankind were beginning to sync with that rhythm, so mesmerized they almost forgot they were trembling with confusion all along. Within just a few weeks of the discovery of Atlas's repeating light rhythm, the world transformed into one vast orchestra. Everywhere from cutting-edge laboratories to corner coffee shops, from university lecture halls to family living rooms, people tried to listen to and translate that pulsing light. It was no longer treated as cold astronomical data, but as a mysterious melody followed with devotion by billions. Fascination spread like a fever. Music was the first field to respond. DJs converted the light data into electronic beats, staging massive sound and light festivals that drew hundreds of thousands of people. Tracks with titles like Atlas Symphony and Rhythm of the Stranger topped global charts. People danced, sang, and in the ecstasy of the music, they believed they were merging with the heartbeat of the cosmos. Some classical composers even wrote symphonies based on the frequency patterns, performed in grand theatres where audiences sat in silence, eyes blurred with tears, as though they were hearing a distant call from beyond the stars. The visual arts also erupted. Painters reimagined Atlas in hundreds of forms: a silent deity, a colossal eye, a gateway spiraling into infinity. Architects designed structures inspired by its glowing veins, raising buildings that looked as if streams of light were flowing through their walls. Children stacked toy bricks to build models of Atlas, while museums opened full exhibitions titled The Language of Light. The entire planet was immersed in a collective rapture, where every individual found their own way to connect with the interstellar stranger. Alongside art, science advanced with unprecedented intensity. Thousands of independent research teams analyzed the rhythmic light pulses, publishing their results openly online. Some mathematicians claimed to have found sequences of prime numbers, hinting at intelligence. One linguistics group declared the rhythms mirrored the cadence of human speech. Physicists, meanwhile, pushed back, insisting it was all a coincidence, the byproduct of gas eruptions within Atlas's core. The fierce debate didn't diminish public fascination. If anything, it made them even more curious, because the lack of a definitive answer only deepened the allure of the mystery. Yet beneath the intoxication, unease began to surface. Was humanity truly listening to the rhythm of an intelligence from a distant civilization, or simply projecting its own dreams onto a natural phenomenon? Some critics warned, we risk becoming self-deluded, hearing messages where there is only wind. But even those warnings couldn't extinguish the collective fire. People kept searching, kept listening, kept creating. A quiet anxiety lingered in every gaze. If this is a message, when will it be decoded? And if it isn't, when will we finally wake from the dream? Whether artist or scientist, believer or skeptic, no one could escape Atlas's pull. It became the centerpiece of every conversation, every dream, every creative project. And in that obsession, humanity entered a strange new chapter, as if they were living through a second enlightenment, while also dreaming inside a vision with no clear end. The Atlas fever showed no sign of fading. On the contrary, the longer it lingered, the more it morphed into something far stronger: collective fanaticism. Whenever the music built from Atlas's light rhythms echoed across public squares, thousands and then tens of thousands gathered, singing in unison, clapping in time, as if taking part in a sacred ceremony. New spiritual movements arose, calling themselves Children of the Light. They believed Atlas was not merely an interstellar object, but a cosmic teacher, sending rhythmic pulses to awaken humankind. At their all-night rituals, people donned white robes, held candles in their hands, eyes lifted toward the heavens, voices chanting refrains drawn from Atlas's flickering frequencies. The sight was both majestic and unsettling, an entire planet intoxicated, swept into a collective trance. International media covered it relentlessly. Images of massive crowds raising their arms toward the sky spread across screens everywhere, sparking shock and awe. Some sociologists issued urgent warnings. We are witnessing the birth of a new global religion. Governments felt cornered to intervene, and they risked being accused of suppressing faith. Stand back, and the movement might spiral out of control. Even the scientific community was drawn into the whirlpool. Once cautious researchers now declared publicly that the flawless repetition of the rhythm cannot be random. Meanwhile, skeptical scientists fired back with op-eds labeling the whole phenomenon a collective hallucination legitimized by technology. The debate hardened into battle lines, no longer about raw data, but about meaning and the future course of humanity itself. The fractures spread into everyday life. Families became the first battleground. Parents embraced the idea that Atlas was a herald of a new enlightenment, while their children scoffed, dismissing it as nothing more than unusual gas eruptions. Brothers and sisters quarreled bitterly, some even cutting ties, one side believing, the other doubting. On social media, discussions exploded into verbal wars, with millions of comments flooding in within hours, not only debating, but attacking one another. Half the world lived in rapture, the other half in disarray. Atlas, drifting silently through space, had sown a psychological rift across the Earth. Bewilderment became the common state. People did not know if they were participants in the greatest event in history, or victims of self-inflicted delusion. They laughed, but trembled. They believed, but feared. For if Atlas truly was sending a message, then humanity was standing at the threshold of dialogue with an alien intelligence, a turning point that would overturn the foundations of philosophy, religion, and science. But if not, then humanity was no more than a sleepwalker, weaving an immense collective illusion out of a handful of cold, indifferent pulses of light. Anxiety suffused everything, the hope that they held in their hands, the secret of the cosmos, and the dread that it was nothing but a fragile mirage, ready to shatter at any moment. And so, in this intoxication, humanity both lifted its head high and lowered it in doubt. They lifted it to breathe in the feeling of being called by the universe. They lowered it, uncertain whether it was truth or merely the echo of their own yearning. Atlas remained silent, sending no new signals beyond its steady rhythm. Yet it was precisely that silence that pulled people deeper into the spiral of obsession. A spiral no one wished to escape, for even trembling, they had grown too accustomed to the sweetness of the trance. As the autumn of 2027 drew to a close, the frenzy surrounding Atlas reached a point of saturation. The light festivals and concerts mimicking its rhythm continued, but the initial wave of ecstatic madness gave way to a different emotion, a contemplative passion. People no longer screamed in wild excitement. Instead, they sat in silence for hours, watching, listening, letting the rhythm seep into their hearts like a wordless prayer. Atlas was no longer just a phenomenon. It had become a part of humanity's spiritual life. Yet precisely as the passion began to settle, another undercurrent crept in. Bewilderment. Scientists announced that for months the rhythm had not changed. No stronger, no weaker, no new patterns emerging. Some spoke candidly. Perhaps we have dreamed too much. Perhaps this is nothing more than a natural phenomenon, and we have woven illusions around it. These words shook the crowds. They longed to believe, yet felt themselves deflate, as if waking in the middle of a beautiful dream. Anxious uncertainty became the new refrain. On social media, millions shared the same sentiment. I still believe, but I fear the day Atlas will leave without leaving anything behind. That fear haunted families. Parents told their children about the language of light, but when the children asked, "What does it say?" the only answer was silence, accompanied by a strained smile. Faith and fear blended into a fragile state, trembling with hope that they held the key to the cosmos, while fearing it was all a trick of nature. Still, even in the midst of this unease, fascination did not disappear. Theatres continued staging plays inspired by Atlas. Poets wrote page-long verses about the heartbeat of the stranger. Children filled their notebooks with drawings of countless shining lines racing across the paper. The whole planet seemed to agree, silently. Whether Atlas was an alien intelligence or not, it had already become a wellspring of creativity, a miracle that made humanity lift its head together. By year's end, a global survey revealed a startling reality. More than 80% of respondents believed Atlas had meaning for humanity, regardless of whether they thought it was a signal or a natural event. This showed that fascination no longer depended on proof, it had become a cultural faith. Atlas did not exist only out there in space. It had taken root in human hearts and minds. And so, As 2027 came to an end, humanity stood before a strange paradox, both satisfied and unsettled. Satisfied, because they had tasted what it felt like to be touched by the universe, to live in a moment where questions became the lifeblood of all activity, yet unsettled, because no one knew how long Atlas would remain, or whether its rhythm would ever transform into a clear reply. Atlas drifted on, silent, steady, shining without change. It did not emphasize, it did not explain, it did not yield, and yet it was that very silence that allowed passion to stretch into eternity. Humanity, in uncertainty and in trembling belief, continued to watch because they had grown accustomed to living with that rhythm. And perhaps, in this half-belief, half-doubt, they had learned the greatest lesson of all, that wisdom is not always found in answers, but in the ability to keep searching while holding on to a burning passion. The year 2028 opened under an atmosphere utterly different from the years before. The fever, the frenzy, the dazzling festivals of light surrounding Atlas had passed. In their place came a new state of being, contemplation. After 2 years of living alongside its mysterious rhythm, humanity seemed to have learned how to grow quiet. The concerts continued, but no longer burned with the same fire. The debates still carried on, but in softer tones, as though humankind had entered a new stage, one in which Atlas was no longer seen merely as an extraterrestrial object, but as a mirror reflecting the essence of existence itself. Philosophers across the globe put forth their interpretations. Some called Atlas the silent teacher, a wanderer from afar, reminding humanity of the limits of its knowledge. Others compared it to an unwritten Buddhist sutra, compelling people to turn inward to seek meaning. Still others described Atlas as a cosmic mirror, a place where humanity could see its own longing to understand, to be acknowledged, and to know it was not alone. These interpretations varied, but all shared a common thread. Atlas had moved beyond astronomy, becoming a philosophical symbol of the age. Yet beneath that quiet contemplation, worry lingered like an underground stream. Scientific reports revealed that Atlas was slowly drifting away. Its trajectory would carry it beyond direct observation within only a few years, which meant that if humanity failed to understand, failed to grasp, the chance could slip away forever, leaving nothing but emptiness behind. The thought kept many scientists awake at night. In their laboratories, the pressure mounted. We only have a few years left. When the public heard this, they sighed, unsettled like hosts bidding farewell to a mysterious guest who had knocked on their door, sat silently on their porch, and now prepared to vanish back into the dark without ever speaking a word. Atlas felt like a visitor who lingered quietly for years, only now to rise and leave. But this worry did not carry only shades of sorrow, it also sowed seeds of hope. For if Atlas had come once, who could say it would not return or that there were not other visitors out there? If the universe had opened its door once, that door could not remain shut forever. Many began to think differently. Atlas was not the answer, but the suggestion. It had not arrived to hand over a solution, but to remind humanity to begin a longer journey, the journey of learning how to listen, to observe, and to accept living with the unknown. In schools, children were taught not only astronomy, but philosophy. One teacher said, "Atlas teaches us that silence itself is a language, and that language is harder to master than any written word." In churches and temples, sermons no longer centered solely on prayer, but urged the faithful to see Atlas as a reminder. Life is fragile, time is brief, but it is the act of seeking that gives existence its value. Across the planet from east to west, from north to south, a new awareness slowly seeped in. People were still worried, still felt the unease of a fleeting opportunity. Yet within that unease lay a thin layer of hope, the hope that Atlas was only the beginning, a trial, a mirror held up for humanity to see itself, so that it might grow wiser on its journey toward the cosmos. And so, in 2028, humanity lifted its gaze to the sky with different eyes. They no longer waited for Atlas to speak. Instead, they began learning how to speak to themselves. If 2028 began with quiet reflection in the minds of individuals, only a few months later, that stillness had swelled into a wave of collective contemplation. Across the planet, people began organizing gatherings no longer centered on entertainment but steeped in philosophy. In Rome, the central square turned into a meeting ground where philosophers, priests, and scientists stood side by side on the podium, debating the meaning of Atlas. In Kyoto, Zen monks held all-night meditation sessions under the starlit sky, treating Atlas as a cosmic koan through which to reflect on existence. In New York, a forum titled "The Silence of Atlas, the Voice of Humanity" drew tens of thousands. People came not to find answers, but to learn how to live with the question. Science, too, shifted its posture. In earlier years, astronomers simply published data, hoping to decode the phenomenon. But by now, many research groups had begun to write reports with a philosophical tone. If Atlas never answers, can we live with that? What is the meaning of observation if the observed remains silent? These questions had outgrown the boundaries of the laboratory and had become meditations on life itself. The scientific community, long regarded as the realm of dry rationality, now stood shoulder to shoulder with monks and philosophers in asking about the meaning of existence. Yet within this deepening reflection, worry still crept in. Orbital predictions grew sharper. Within just a few years, Atlas would drift out of easy range. If humanity did not act, if it failed to reach out, this rare moment could slip away forever. Many scientists urge we must send a signal, attempt contact, before Atlas moves too far. But there was strong resistance. We know too little. Is it safe to speak first? This debate was not merely technical. It carried the weight of a primal fear, the fear that silence might mean losing the chance, and the fear that speaking might mean courting danger. Amid that anxiety, a thread of hope began to shine through. People started to realize that the value of Atlas lay not only in whether it gave an answer, but in the fact that it had compelled humanity to look inward. Community movements spread worldwide. Global hours of contemplation were organized, where millions of people turned off their lights and sat quietly, gazing at the sky. Many confessed they had never before felt so connected. Hope was no longer only the hope for a message from out there, it was the hope that, thanks to Atlas, people had learned to truly listen to each other. Within this layered spectrum of emotion, reflection, worry, and hope, Atlas continued drifting in silence, offering no promise, no explanation. Yet its very silence made the collective experience deeper. Sometimes, a clear answer can close the door to searching, but an open question can become the driving force of an entire civilization. As 2028 unfolded, predictions about Atlas's trajectory grew sharper. Scientific reports repeated the same warning. In only a few more years, it would drift too far to be observed with current telescopes. Those cold numbers seeded a quiet but gnawing unease in humanity's heart. It was as if the whole planet were living inside a book where the final page was already visible, and everyone feared they might not finish reading the story in time. In the great cities, electronic billboards did more than show news about Atlas. They displayed countdowns of how much clear observation time remained. The numbers pulsed like a collective heartbeat, reminding humanity that the window of opportunity was more fragile than ever. People began to speak of Atlas not only as the interstellar stranger, but as the fleeting chance. And this very finiteness, paradoxically, became a source of philosophical energy. Humanity realized that everything precious in life becomes sacred precisely because it does not last forever. Philosophical forums spread everywhere, where thinkers debated the value of impermanence. One scholar argued, if Atlas stayed forever, we would soon take it for granted, but because it will leave, it becomes a once-in-a-lifetime moment. Another countered, no, its value lies not in leaving but in having come at all. We do not lose Atlas, we simply return to the emptiness that was always there. These conversations never reached conclusions, yet they left the public with the sense that they were living inside a collective philosophical chapter, where every sentence and every thought circled fragility and transience. Meanwhile, worry was not only abstract, it was painfully real. Many organizations urged immediate investment to launch a probe to intercept Atlas before it was too late. Yet every plan stumbled against the same questions. Could it be done in time? Would it be safe? Was it worth gambling on an object that remained silent? This tug of war left countless people in a state of constant restlessness, standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to leap forward or retreat. And yet, amid all this unease, a thread of hope gleamed. Hope that the very brevity of the moment would force humanity to grow faster, act bolder. Hope that Atlas, through its steadfast silence, was teaching a lesson, to treasure every moment, to turn worry into action, to transform the finite into eternity through memory and knowledge. Across the globe, community movements arose, encouraging people to record their Atlas memories in journals, in paintings, in songs, in films. Humanity was no longer simply waiting for an answer. It was actively weaving its own spiritual legacy around the event. And through all these layers of feeling, reflection, worry, hope, Atlas continued to drift across the sky, neither faster nor slower, revealing nothing more than its familiar pulses of light. But perhaps it was that very calmness that touched the human heart most deeply, because in confronting finitude, people were learning that true value lies not in the length of a moment, but in the depth of how we choose to live within it. By the end of 2028, as debates about Atlas had spread across every forum, a new awareness quietly took shape. People began to see Atlas not only as a mystery of the cosmos, but as a metaphor for the very existence of humanity itself. In philosophy classrooms, professors asked their students, if Atlas is nothing more than a silent fragment of ice and rock, why has it moved billions of people? Could it be because we see ourselves reflected in its fragility? The question fell like a weight, and the lecture hall went silent. Because the truth was undeniable. Humanity is like Atlas, a drifting entity in the endless void, carrying its own fragile light, yet always facing the possibility of dissolving, vanishing as if it never existed. This comparison stirred a deeper anxiety. People realized that not only was Atlas moving away, but human civilization itself could one day vanish. Climate change, wars, and pandemics all were reminders that humanity is not eternal. At public forums, many admitted, Atlas isn't what frightens us. What frightens us is realizing that we, too, are finite. That admission echoed like a collective sigh, sending a shiver through the planet. And yet, alongside that anxiety rose a current of hope, because if existence is finite, then every moment becomes infinitely more precious. People began to change the way they lived, slowing down frantic work routines, spending more time with family, writing letters by hand, planting trees, and creating small but lasting memories. Atlas reminded me that I am not immortal, and because of that, I must live fully, a woman in Berlin shared on a television program. Her simple words spread across social media, becoming a slogan embraced by millions. Religious traditions, too, shifted their tone. Instead of preaching only about salvation, they began to emphasize cherishing life here and now. A Catholic priest in Brazil preached, "We keep praying to hear a message from Atlas, but perhaps the message is already here. Love while you still can." Similarly, a Buddhist monk in Nepal taught, Atlas teaches us impermanence, but impermanence is not for mourning, it is for awakening, is not fear. The Reismo's take, this philosophical turn transformed Atlas into a double-edged symbol, both a source of fear and of hope. Fear, because it reflected humanity's own mortality. Hope, because it reminded us that within mortality lies the depth of meaning. Instead of being consumed by unease, people began learning to use unease itself as fuel to live more fully, more consciously, more awake. In the night sky, Atlas remained only a silent point of light. But on Earth, it had become a spiritual mirror, where each person, when lifting their gaze, saw their own reflection, anxious because of limits, yet hopeful, because within those limits lies the freedom to choose, to love, to live. As 2028 drew to a close, the clearest outcome was not a scientific discovery, nor proof of extraterrestrial intelligence. The clearest truth was this: Atlas had become a global philosophy of life. Few still waited for new surprises in the sky. People had grown accustomed to the repeating pulse of light, accustomed to its unchanging silence. But instead of disappointment, humanity transformed that familiarity into the foundation of a new kind of maturity, a maturity born of contemplation. In many places, people carved the image of Atlas onto city walls, into paintings, even onto tombstones. It was no longer a symbol of mystery, but of inner dialogue. Looking at Atlas, people remembered that they had once trembled, once been enraptured, once been anxious to the point of breathlessness. But above all, they remembered that they had once dared to hope. And that hope, fragile though it was, had kept humanity from sinking into the darkness of meaninglessness. In lecture halls, philosophy students debated whether Atlas was a test of humility. One professor declared, "The universe does not hand us answers. It hands us questions, and the way we live with those questions is the answer." His words were recorded, spread across the world, and became a guiding principle for an entire generation. In public squares, groups of contemporary dancers staged performances, reenacting humanity's smallness, orbiting a great sphere of light, sometimes trembling, reaching out to embrace it. Audiences wept, not because they understood, but because they felt they had touched something deeper than words. And yet, within all this contemplation, anxiety never disappeared. Each time people thought of the day Atlas would leave, a shiver ran through them. Without it, could humanity keep this flame of reflection alive? Or would it fall back into the familiar spiral of greed and ignorance? Would the lesson endure, or fade like countless others that had been forgotten? That fear drove many communities to establish Atlas libraries, archives preserving every note, image, song, and poem born since its arrival. They hoped that even when the object drifted away, the spiritual legacy it had inspired would remain. From within that fear, however, rose a powerful current of hope. Atlas had shown that humanity could change, that it could set aside fear and selfishness, if only for a time, to look together in the same direction. Some scholars called it the human moment, a moment when the entire planet, across languages and cultures, shared a single experience. Hope no longer pointed outward to Atlas, but inward to humanity itself. If people could unite once over a mystery, then surely they could unite again to face other challenges. Climate change, war, poverty. Atlas did not solve any problem, but it revealed humanity's profound capacity, the capacity to seek meaning together. And so, as the final days of the year passed, humanity looked up at Atlas once more, not with pleading, not with demands, but with a whisper, "Thank you for coming." In that whisper lay both worry and hope. Worry that the lesson might be forgotten, but hope that it would remain etched forever. Atlas kept drifting, kept silent. It had never promised, never replied, but it was precisely that silence that left the loudest echo, a reminder that the universe does not grant us answers, but grants us the chance to grow in contemplation, in anxiety, and in hope. The year 2029 opened under a sky still carrying the familiar trace of Atlas. Though it had drifted far beyond the distance of its first appearance, that faint glow remained strong enough to draw the gaze of billions each night. Humanity knew Atlas would not stay forever, that it was slowly moving out of reach, like a guest quietly stepping out of a room after sitting silently by our side for years. And it was precisely this fragility that ushered humankind into a new state of mind, awakening. This awakening was no longer loud or feverish like in the early days, when headlines screamed that it might be a signal from a distant civilization. Nor was it the wild ecstasy of the light festival years, when musicians and artists turned its rhythm into a collective symphony. Instead, it had settled into something quieter, deeper, steadier, as an underground river nourishing an entire forest. People began to look at Atlas as a mirror of themselves, no longer asking, "What is it?" but "What have we learned from it?" In universities, new courses emerged under names like interstellar philosophy or cosmic ethics. Professors lectured, "Atlas does not only teach us astronomy, it teaches us humility. The universe does not always give answers, but its silence is a test of our patience." Students sat quietly for hours, not to scribble equations, but to absorb the weight of those words. In research institutes, scientific reports shifted in tone. Instead of focusing only on light cycles or chemical composition, many groups began discussing humanity's responsibility. What will we do if one day we actually receive a clear signal? Should we respond? Should we remain silent? And if we do respond, what should we say? These questions echoed not merely as technical puzzles, but as moral dilemmas, questions of survival. One scientist at the United Nations declared, "Atlas is not just a marvel, it is a rehearsal for the future. If we are unprepared, our naivety could be our greatest danger." Every day, life, too, began to change. Families formed new habits of sky-gazing each evening, treating it like a spiritual ritual. Parents told their children, "Look up there, that's Atlas, the visitor who taught humanity patience." Small communities began hosting Atlas memory circles, where people shared their first encounters with it and the lessons they had drawn. No longer were there cheers and shouts, but slow, trembling voices, full of quiet reverence. All of this distilled into two words: awakening. Yet this awakening was inseparable from another attitude: caution. Humanity understood that if Atlas could shake the planet to its core with silence alone, then one day, if the universe were truly to speak, we must be wise enough to respond with care. Caution no longer meant paralyzing hesitation, but a clear-eyed awareness that any rash step could bring consequences beyond imagining. Thus, in the early months of 2029, at international conferences, from the United Nations to newly formed treaties, one concept surfaced again and again: cosmic responsibility. This responsibility was not merely to protect Earth, but to preserve the dignity of humanity itself, to prove that, when confronted with the unknown, we were no longer frightened children, but a civilization capable of listening, reflecting, and acting with respect for the cosmos. And so, in the eyes of billions, Atlas was no longer just a distant lump of ice and stone. It had become the symbol of a profound lesson: to awaken after frenzy, to remain cautious after ecstasy, and to prepare, patiently, for the day when the universe may truly speak. The early months of 2029 witnessed an explosion of forums, conferences, and international declarations on cosmic responsibility. Not only governments, but also scientific, religious, and cultural organizations sought to add their voices. The most heated debate revolved around a single question: should humanity send a signal in response to Atlas? In Geneva, the United Nations convened a special conference that lasted several weeks, gathering thousands of delegates from around the world. Supporters argued that Atlas's prolonged silence might itself be an invitation, and that if humanity lacked the courage to respond, it would be as if we were surrendering a once-in-history opportunity. Opponents, however, warned that no one truly knew what Atlas was, and that a hasty signal could bring unforeseeable consequences. We are knocking on a door without knowing who or what is on the other side. Is that wise? A renowned scientist asked, casting the entire hall into silence. Caution saturated the discussions. Space security experts warned of the danger of accidentally revealing Earth's exact location. Biologists emphasized that even a microscopic alien organism could devastate our ecosystem if contact ever occurred. Philosophers raised the haunting question: have we matured enough to represent an entire planet, or are we simply rushing ahead, desperate to touch the sacred? These reminders echoed like tolling bells, keeping humanity from sliding too far into illusion. And yet, amid the tense atmosphere, an undeniable current of exhilaration spread. For the first time in history, all nations, religions, and social classes sat at the same table to discuss a matter that transcended borders: responsibility before the cosmos. The image of once bitter rivals now shaking hands to talk about humanity's common voice moved the world profoundly. One major newspaper headlined, "Atlas has achieved what centuries of diplomacy failed to do. It forced humanity to look in the same direction." Outside the conference hall, the public followed each development with unusual reverence. People no longer mocked or doubted as before. Instead, they listened intently, as though every line of debate were part of a newly written scripture. Across many cities, community groups organized their own mock sessions, where ordinary citizens role-played as delegates, debating whether or not to send a signal. For them, this was no longer a distant story, but one tied directly to their future and that of their children. Within this atmosphere, two emotions moved in tandem: caution, which compelled people to admit their limits and the risks they faced, and exhilaration, which opened the sense that they were standing at the threshold of a new chapter in history. Together, they produced a resonance unlike anything before, humanity trembling at the edge of infinite darkness, yet holding its head high, conscious, for the first time, of its collective stature. And high above, Atlas remained silent. But perhaps it was that very silence that made the debates meaningful. For people began to understand that it was not Atlas testing them, it was they who were testing themselves. Whether they could hold on to clarity amid excitement, caution amid passion, and reverence when standing face to face with the incomprehensible. After the Geneva Conference, the world entered an unprecedented stage, the stage of global commitments. If before, nations had stopped at debating whether or not to send a signal, now a far broader movement was launched, to prepare for the future as though Atlas were only the prologue. Leading research centers unveiled bold projects. The European Space Agency partnered with NASA and JAXA to design a new generation of probes capable of matching Atlas's trajectory, or at the very least, preparing for the next interstellar visitor. Quantum technology laboratories poured themselves into developing methods to encode cosmic signals, hoping one day to send messages that were both powerful and safe. Humanity seemed to be embarking on a new race, but no longer a race of arms or commerce, rather a race to be heard and to be understood. The spirit of caution remained unmistakably present. Every project had to pass through international ethics committees. Each plan to transmit a signal was scrutinized in the smallest detail, Would it reveal too much about Earth's location? Would it unwittingly bring danger to future generations? At one symposium, a philosopher warned, "Sometimes silence is the wisest answer. But if we choose to speak, every word, every signal must carry humility and reverence." That statement became the guiding principle for countless initiatives, not to speak to flaunt power, but to speak as a sign of awakening. Alongside caution, however, a current of exhilaration spread through society. Young people volunteered for research programs, treating it as a generational duty. Schools hosted Atlas Days, where students wrote letters to the future, describing what message they would want to send into the cosmos. Literature, music, and cinema blossomed, all circling a single idea: that humanity was no longer alone in its search for meaning. Each individual, no matter how small, felt themselves to be part of this collective preparation. In many places, ceremonies were held with solemn reverence. Citizens dressed in white robes gathered beneath starlit skies to read aloud the promises of humanity. They pledged never to use cosmic knowledge for destruction, but for building. They pledged not to let curiosity decay into selfish ambition, but to turn it into a force for unity. These gatherings had no leaders and no lengthy speeches. There was only silence, only eyes lifted upward, and only the shared sense that Atlas was watching. All of this revealed a profound truth. Humanity had truly awakened. Gone were the illusions that Atlas would hand them answers. They understood now that they must become the answers for one another. Gone was the immaturity that once viewed the cosmos as a realm to conquer. They now saw it as a realm to connect. And gone was the shallow ecstasy of gazing at the sky. They had learned to bow their heads with reverence, regarding Atlas's existence as a sacred test. And so, by the end of the summer of 2029, the world was alive with new projects, humming with creative fervor, yet at the same time holding on to a deliberate measure of caution. Humanity had learned an essential lesson: to step forward, but to step forward with eyes wide open and with humble hearts. In the winter of 2029, the long nights and clear skies made Atlas the focal point of millions of eyes. Though it had drifted farther away, its faint light was still enough to remind the world that its presence had not yet vanished. Amid humanity's shivering cold, something quietly took shape: a global spiritual ritual. People no longer looked to Atlas in expectation, but in remembrance, in reverence, and as a reminder that humanity's responsibility had entered a new stage. In New Delhi, tens of thousands gathered along the banks of the Ganges, releasing floating lanterns into the water with promises for the future. In Paris, Notre Dame, still not fully restored after the devastating fire, resounded with the peal of its bells, blending with hymns composed solely for Atlas. In Kenya, Maasai communities held traditional ceremonies, honoring Atlas as an eternal flame and vowing to preserve that flame for generations to come. These images spread across the globe, weaving a tapestry never seen before. Humanity diverse and divided in so many ways, offering collective reverence to a silent guest. At international conferences, the concept of the Atlas Testament was adopted. It was a collective pledge, written into an international charter and preserved in multiple languages. Its content was not a scientific promise, but an ethical one: that humanity would act with mindfulness, would always exercise caution when sending signals, and would not let curiosity swell into arrogance. One clause was highlighted with special care: all generations to come, when faced with new visitors from the cosmos, must remember that Atlas once came, and Atlas taught us humility. What moved the public most was how this testament was revealed, not inside a closed hall, but in an open-air ceremony beneath a star-filled sky. World leaders gave no lengthy speeches. They simply stood together in silence for 1 minute, then lifted their heads toward Atlas. That silence spread through the broadcast waves, causing billions worldwide to pause their activities and look upward. In that moment, the entire planet seemed to unite not through words, but through stillness. And yet, awakening did not stop at ritual. It carried into practice, into policy, into education. Nations established long-term funds for space projects, not to show off, but to carefully prepare for the future. Children were taught that Atlas was a lesson in patience and responsibility. Adults reminded one another that silence itself could be knowledge. Philosophers documented the entire journey from 2025 to 2029, naming it the Mirror Age, the era when humanity saw itself reflected through a distant block of ice and stone. Running beneath all this was a steady current of inspiration. For even as Atlas receded, people understood it had left behind an indelible legacy. The legacy of belief that humanity could stand together on common ground, lift their eyes to the same sky, and find meaning that transcended difference. Atlas did not need to reply, because it had already sparked within humanity a greater answer. That existence is not measured by what we know, but by how we face what we do not know. As the year 2029 came to a close, Atlas continued drifting into the darkness. But for humanity, it had transformed into a silent teacher, a teacher who did not lecture, did not write, did not speak, only appeared and then departed. Yet that simple presence and that quiet departure were enough to teach an entire planet the lessons of awakening, of caution, of inspiration, and above all, of reverence before the boundless universe. The winter skies of 2030 stretched in silence, and within that silence, humanity realized an irreversible truth. Atlas had gone too far. It was no longer as vividly present as in 2025 or 2026, when its image filled every screen and became the center of every conversation. Now, to observe it, people needed the most powerful telescopes, placed in remote observatories hidden in mountains or deserts. Yet its distance did not erase Atlas from memory. On the contrary, it made Atlas more enduring, a collective memory etched into the heart of humankind like a permanent scar. In major cities, museums opened exhibitions called the Atlas Years. Visitors didn't just look at scientific data, they listened again to the music, read the poems, and gazed at the paintings humanity had once created in its frenzy of wonder. Many stood motionless for hours in front of a video, replaying the moment when Atlas's light pulsed in a steady rhythm, beating like a colossal heart. Some wept not out of fear, but because they remembered how the entire world once trembled together before something unexplainable. In those moments, Atlas became part of human history, not through physical presence, but through a spiritual imprint. Philosophers began calling Atlas the silent teacher of the century. They explained that a block of ice and rock, wordless and voiceless, had made humanity reflect on itself more deeply than any event in history. When Atlas first approached, humanity revealed its fear of annihilation. When Atlas hovered in silence, people projected onto it their most hidden questions. When Atlas pulsed with light, they drowned in exhilaration and illusions. And as Atlas receded, they grew still, contemplative, learning to accept the finiteness of both themselves and the universe. In public discussions, people no longer debated what Atlas was, but rather what it had taught them. One scholar remarked, "Atlas left no signal, but its silence forced humanity to speak, and in speaking, we heard ourselves more clearly than ever before." The line was quoted across countless newspapers, shared widely online, and became a reminder to the younger generation that sometimes the value of a phenomenon lies not in the answers it provides, but in the questions it awakens. Many admitted that Atlas's absence was even more moving than its presence had ever been. For as long as it lingered, people could still hope for another surprise, another flicker of signal. But once it moved away, they were forced to confront emptiness itself, and from that emptiness, they discovered inner strength. Global meditation events, silent sky-gazing rituals, and collective vigils were no longer held in expectation of Atlas's return, but as reminders that the moment had already passed, and yet remained powerful enough to echo across generations. In 2030, humanity no longer looked at Atlas with curiosity or fear. They looked with solemnity, with reflection. Atlas now resembled a dream that had ended, but whose resonance continued, like a lingering echo that refuses to fade. And within that echo, humankind understood they had crossed an invisible threshold, not into a new world, but into a deeper layer of their own soul. As Atlas drifted farther away and the celebrations faded, what remained in the hearts of humanity was not regret, but a profound silence. People began to look back on the 4-year journey as if leafing through a vast diary of humankind. Each page carried a different tone of emotion: panic, curiosity, fascination, anxiety, hope. And when that diary closed, readers no longer asked about Atlas, they asked about themselves. Atlas had given no answers, yet it had compelled billions to rewrite the question, what is humanity in this boundless universe? Came May Morting Strideburst. In the first speeches of 2030, many world leaders set aside talk of economics or politics and spoke, instead of Atlas, as a collective philosophical lesson. They called Atlas the silent mirror, a place where humankind saw its smallness but also its yearning to reach beyond. One African president declared, "Atlas did not grant us knowledge, it granted us responsibility, the responsibility to use our curiosity with humility and with care." The words were quoted across the globe, becoming a new motto for many young people stepping into adulthood. In universities, a new field emerged: cosmic humanities, a discipline blending philosophy, science, and theology. Professors lectured, "The silence of Atlas is the voice of finitude. It reminds us that the time of each individual, each civilization, is limited. But it is precisely within limits that we hunger to leave our mark." Students wrote these words down not as abstract knowledge, but as a compass for living. Deep down, they all understood that humanity had been given a rare chance to mature under the gaze of the cosmos. Even as Atlas receded, it continued to astonish every time people revisited old data. The cycles of light, the mysterious oscillations, all remained without explanation. Some scientists kept digging into the archives, like miners in memory, hoping one day a hidden pattern would reveal itself. Yet the greatest wonder was not in the data, but in how humanity had been transformed by it. People marveled at the fact that in just a few years, a silent block of ice and rock had accomplished what centuries of philosophy, religion, and science had never achieved. It had forced humanity to pause, to listen, and to reflect inward. From that astonishment, a new stream of hope arose. No longer was it the hope that Atlas would send another signal, but the hope that its lesson would echo forever. Many nations founded Atlas Institutes, schools dedicated to teaching the next generation how to unite knowledge with humility. Children growing up in the 2030 seconds were told, "Atlas may have gone, but it still lives in our hearts, like a lantern lighting the path ahead." This hope no longer reached outward to the skies, but inward to humankind itself, that they could continue to live, to study, to create with the spirit Atlas had planted within them. And so, in the quiet, humanity discovered a philosophy: the universe owes us no answers. Yet even a fleeting presence like Atlas is enough reason to look inward, to be astonished by our own capacity for growth, and to hope that one day, when the next visitor arrives, we will be more prepared, more wise, and more worthy. Even though Atlas had travelled far, it left behind a colossal archive: millions of hours of observation, billions of data points, thousands of light records. In the years after it slipped from sight, research institutes continued to dig tirelessly into this legacy, and little by little, new wonders emerged, as if Atlas was still whispering to humanity through the memory it left behind. A group of scientists in Chile announced they had uncovered a subtle pattern in the light oscillations, a delicate repetition no one had noticed before. The cycle matched no known astronomical phenomenon, and the discovery stunned the scientific community. It wasn't enough to prove the presence of extraterrestrial intelligence, but it was enough to rekindle the question, what have we missed? The news spread across the world, reigniting that trembling awe, the same feeling that had once kept humanity awake in the years 2025 and 2026. In many places, the public embraced the finding, not just as science, but as a reminder that Atlas had never truly been silent. In discussion forums, people said, "Maybe Atlas never sent us a message, but perhaps its very presence was the message." Artists quickly began creating new works, treating the discovered light cycle as a fragmented symphony. Paintings, songs, and poems reappeared, proof that the memory of Atlas would never close. It had only changed form, shifting from physical light into spiritual light. Amid this quiet reflection, a new current of hope flickered to life. If a block of silent ice and rock had been enough to transform humankind, then surely the universe held countless other mysteries waiting to be found. Hope no longer rested on decoding Atlas, but on preparing for the visitors yet to come. Space academies launched programs called The Journey After Atlas, where students were trained not only in science but in philosophy, how to practice humility, how to listen to silence, how to live with questions that may never be answered. Ordinary people, too, discovered hope in their daily lives. In Buenos Aires, a group of elders formed a club called Friends of Atlas, where they told children stories about the years when humanity lived under its mystery. In Norway, schools hosted Atlas Nights, where students wrote down dreams for the future, believing that one day another generation might encounter a second Atlas. These activities carried no trace of panic or fanaticism, but instead a gentleness, as though humankind had finally learned how to turn mystery into quiet hope. And so, In the stillness of 2030, humanity reflected in silence on the legacy of Atlas, stood in wonder at the fact that they were still learning from it, and nurtured a tender hope that this visit had not been the only event, but the prologue to a much longer story. Atlas had gone, but it left humanity with a new horizon not written across the sky, but etched deep within the human soul. By the end of 2030, Atlas had vanished from the night sky. No longer visible to the naked eye, only the most powerful telescopes could still capture its faint glow at the distant edge of space. And yet, paradoxically, as its physical image disappeared, its spiritual image burned brighter than ever. Across every continent, people no longer looked upward to wait for it, they looked inward, into themselves. And in that quiet reflection, they realized Atlas was never just a celestial body. It had become a mirror, reflecting the essence of humanity. That mirror revealed everything: the primal fear of confronting the incomprehensible for the first time, the feverish ecstasy of chasing belief in illusion, the division and arguments born of unanswered questions, and finally, the maturity of learning to accept silence as part of the journey. Each stage of Atlas was a stage of humanity itself, and in gazing at it, people saw the condensed history of their own soul played out over just a handful of years. The astonishment lay in this: how could an inert block of ice and rock, by silent presence alone, stir so deeply in the hearts of billions? How could it bring warring nations to the same table, strangers to clasp hands under the stars, and an entire civilization to learn humility? The truth was beyond understanding, and perhaps because of that, it became a miracle. And that miracle did not reside in Atlas itself, but in humanity, in its capacity to feel, to reflect, and to grow because of a stranger. From that astonishment spread a new hope. No longer the hope that Atlas would return, but the hope that humanity would keep the flame alive for generations to come. Education systems began to enshrine the Atlas journey as an official part of history, standing alongside the great milestones of the past. Children were taught Atlas did not give us answers, but through it, we learned to live with questions. Many young people took those words as a compass, to never stop being curious, but to always be cautious, to never stop searching, but to always remain humble. All over the world, monuments to Atlas were erected not as images of a celestial rock, but as vast mirrors placed in public squares. Passers-by would see their own reflection, a reminder that Atlas was not out there, but within their eyes and hearts. A 1-minute ritual of silence before these mirrors slowly became a global tradition, one that transcended nationality, religion, and language. And so, as humanity closed a decade of upheaval, Atlas remained not as a speck of light in the cosmos, but as a living memory, a philosophical lesson, a silent reminder that the universe does not need to give us answers. Its single visit was enough to plant within humanity a profound sense of wonder, along with a resilient hope that people would not waste the lesson, hope that from now on, whenever they looked up at the sky, they would not only search for life out there, but also search for life deep within themselves. Atlas was gone, but its echoes would never fade. It lived on in memory, in philosophy, in every upward glance when humanity asked itself, who are we, and who will we become in this boundless universe?